Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly behind the heavy velvet curtains of one of the most tightly buttoned up, scandal-averse, emotionally constipated eras in British history, Victorian England. But don't let the stiff collars and endless tea service fool you. This place is a powder keg of repressed desire, forbidden romances, and absolutely delicious hypocrisy. You're about to eavesdrop on love stories that were never supposed to exist. Affairs that bloomed behind closed doors and coded glances under layers of silk and starched decorum. Affairs that, frankly, could have gotten you disowned, institutionalized, or dead. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. I always love knowing where and when you're listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in the middle of a perfectly manicured Victorian drawing room. It smells faintly of beeswax and lavender polish, the kind that sticks to every surface and smothers any real sense of spontaneity. Around you, the furniture sits in stiff silence. Velvet upholstery that never dares wrinkle, doilies that haven't moved in years. Everything in this room is about appearances, and in Victorian England, appearances are everything. Outside the window, the world is changing. The industrial age is booming, smokestacks are clawing the sky, and people are flocking into cities faster than chimneys can keep up. But inside this room, stillness, silence, control. You can hear the faint ticking of the mantel clock reminding you that time and expectations march forward whether you want them to or not. You're a guest tonight, upper middle class, respectable, which means you're under constant surveillance, not from the police but from society itself. Neighbours, church ladies, the postman, your cousin who always stops by when he's bored and judgmental. They all watch. And in this world where a misstep could make or break your entire future, being watched is exhausting. You glance at the mirror and there it is, your reflection, dressed impeccably. Your waist cinched a little too tight, or your collar buttoned a little too high. Fashion in this era isn't just about looking good. It's armour. The corsets, the cuffs, the endless layers, they're all a kind of chastity belt, a constant physical reminder to behave. But people don't always behave. You're not even through your first cup of tea when the hostess leans in a little too closely to her neighbour's husband. Her fan flutters in a rhythm that looks meaningless, unless you know the code. And you do. 2 slow swishes and a snap. I long to be alone with you. You try not to raise an eyebrow. This is the Victorian age, but it's not passionless. It's just that passion must be dressed up in codes, lies, and ritual. There's something almost theatrical about it all. Society throws down a strict script, courtship, marriage, propriety, and everyone's expected to stick to their lines. But behind the curtains, off stage, there's a different story playing out. You start to notice the little tells. A blush that lingers too long, a man who takes his wife's best friend's hand just a little too slowly, the maid who watches her mistress with something deeper than loyalty in her eyes. Every one of them is hiding something, and they have to. This isn't the kind of world where love is safe. It's the kind of world where getting caught with the wrong person doesn't just mean heartbreak. It means exile, scandal, or being quietly sent away to a sanitarium for your health. You probably won't survive this, emotionally speaking. There's an actual historical moment for everything in this world, even when it comes to policing love. For instance, did you know that in 1885 Parliament passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act? It raised the age of consent, but it also included a sneaky little clause, Section 11, criminalising gross indecency between men. It was that same law that would later destroy Oscar Wilde. It didn't matter if it was consensual, it didn't matter if it was private. If you loved the wrong person, the law could still find you. Yet people still loved. They just got creative about it. Here's a weird one for you. Some couples would hide love letters in hollowed-out Bibles. The Book of Psalms was a favourite. Appropriate, right? One woman even stitched her lover's initials into the lining of her corset, knowing he'd be the only one to ever see them. These weren't just little flirtations. These were entire lifetimes of coded affection. They risked everything for stolen moments. And you wonder, was the repression the reason the love was so fierce? Does making something forbidden give it weight, urgency, meaning? Scholars argue about this a lot. Some say the Victorians weren't as prudish as we think. They were just better at hiding what they wanted. Others argue that the fear and restrictions warped their sense of intimacy entirely. You think maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. People were people, messy, complicated, horny, repressed, and brilliant at working around the rules. A candle flickers, and you realise how much darkness there was in the age of light. For all its talk of morality, so much of Victorian society was built on lies. Marriages of convenience, affairs behind curtains, mistresses in secret apartments, lovers buried in unmarked graves. But also, notes passed under doors, kisses stolen in servants' stairwells, midnight horseback rides to nowhere in particular, moments that probably felt more real than anything that happened in daylight. Tonight you're not here to judge, you're just here to listen, to witness, to remember what they tried to keep hidden, and maybe to understand a little more about how love always finds a way, even when the world says it shouldn't. You wake to the quiet rustle of starched linens and the low chime of a carriage bell outside your window. Morning in Victorian England begins with restraint. A maid glides through your chamber, silent as a ghost, drawing the curtains in one practiced sweep. Outside, the streets are already humming with the daily ballet. Flower girls setting up baskets, chimney sweeps darting across rooftops, and gentlemen tipping their hats to passing ladies like they rehearsed it in a mirror. Everyone's playing their part, but today, your mind is on the theatre of love, or, more accurately, the ironclad rules of Victorian courtship. Because falling in love here isn't simple. It's a chess game with elaborate costumes, elaborate manners, and rules so strict they might as well be carved in stone. And every move you make is under surveillance. You can't just walk up to someone and say, "Hey, I think you're cute." That's not only socially suicidal, it's nearly criminal. You dress carefully for the morning's outing, which is not so much a date as it is a performance. There's a promenade in Hyde Park, a perfectly acceptable place for a proper lady and gentleman to see and be seen. You've been told to walk slowly, look pleasant, and above all, avoid seeming eager. Eagerness is desperate, and desperation in this world is repulsive. As you step onto the gravel path, your escort beside you, the tension is immediate. Your hands don't touch. You speak in careful, measured tones. Everything has to feel effortless, even though you're hyper-aware of every blink, every syllable. Say too much, and you're forward. Say too little, and you're cold. The space between you crackles with unsaid things. You exchange polite smiles, a compliment on the weather, a passing mention of a concert at the Albert Hall. Romance, if it happens at all, must be cultivated over months like an orchid in a drafty greenhouse. Now here's the kicker. Most couples didn't even get to choose who they were courting. Marriages were arranged with the subtlety of business deals. A family's wealth, property, social standing, those were the deciding factors. Love? That was a bonus maybe, if you were lucky. The newspapers of the time even printed marriage announcements with the coldness of stock updates. A suitable match has been arranged between Mr. Edward Wainwright of Kensington and Miss Julia Penrose of Sussex. You might as well have said, two entities have merged for fiscal advantage. Romantic. So how did love ever find a way? Well, it tried. In every sideways glance, every heartbeat hidden beneath layers of satin, you start to pick up on the unspoken language. A lady dropping her glove was an invitation to be approached. A flower placed strategically in the hair could say, "I'm interested." The kind of flower mattered too. Lavender for devotion, yellow rose for jealousy, a red carnation if you dared to whisper, "Yes." And then, of course, there was the fan. The humble fan was a woman's secret weapon. Closed in the right hand. "Follow me," touched to the lips. "Kiss me," held open over the left ear. "I want to get out of here." A single flutter of lace could say more than a love letter. Speaking of which, writing was everything. You weren't supposed to be alone together, so you wrote. Pages of longing disguised as pleasantries. The postal system, bless it, became a love-fueled underground network. Lovers timed their walks around mail delivery. Some bribed servants to smuggle letters through kitchens and side gates. One couple even used a series of books in the local library, tucking notes between pages of Milton and Shakespeare. That's one way to make Paradise Lost romantic. But it wasn't all sweet. You pass an older woman on your walk seated on a bench with a tight smile and tired eyes. Her story is written in the lines on her face. Courting was not a whimsical adventure for women. It was a narrow bridge over a cliff. If a young lady made one wrong move, was caught in a compromising position, even just seen alone with a man, her entire future could be wrecked. No more invitations, no more suitors, just whispers behind fans and mothers hurrying their sons away. Ruined, they'd say, and no one cared whether the man was to blame. One actual case, a girl named Clara met a soldier at a railway station. They shared a bench for 20 minutes, unchaperoned. Nothing happened, but someone saw. By the end of the week, her engagement was broken off and her name scrubbed from guest lists. He? Promoted to lieutenant. So while scholars today debate whether Victorian society was truly repressive or just misunderstood, the stakes were painfully clear to those living it. One scholar argues that courtship rituals were empowering, that women learned to wield subtle influence. Another insists the rituals were a straitjacket, trapping both men and women in roles that left little room for honesty. You don't have the answer, but you know how exhausting it feels to smile through every moment and pretend none of it matters. You return from the park, gloves slightly scuffed, your feet aching. Did your escort feel something too, or was he just ticking boxes on the path to inheritance? You'll never know. And that's the worst part. Feelings are dangerous, but uncertainty is worse. You sit on your window seat and write nothing. No diary, no letters, just silence. That's how most of these stories end. Never told, never written down. Just a polite nod at the door and a lifetime of wondering what might have been. Later that night you overhear your aunt gossiping about another cousin's engagement. He's not in love with her, of course, but she'll be good for his prospects. Everyone nods, like this is fine, normal, expected. And maybe it is. But you can't help wondering how many people lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wishing they could have chosen differently. How many weddings were celebrations of compromise? How many courtships were just drawn-out negotiations? And how many hearts broke quietly, never noticed, never mourned? You close your eyes, thinking of fans, flowers and gloves dropped in the dirt. A whole language of longing performed in broad daylight under the watchful eye of a society determined not to see it. You're seated at the edge of a garden party, somewhere between the lemon tarts and the rose hedge, watching a pair of women deep in conversation under a lace-trimmed parasol. To the untrained eye, it looks like idle chatter, an exchange about flowers or the latest piano concert at someone's estate. But you're not untrained anymore. You've learned how to listen in this world, to read the way words don't match body language. One woman is laughing just a little too brightly, brushing a lock of hair from the other's cheek in a gesture so tender it has to be disguised as clumsiness. The other woman blushes, not the shy kind, but the burning kind, the kind that comes from being truly seen. You look away. Not because you're embarrassed, but because you know how dangerous this moment is for them. Victorian England had 1,000 ways to suppress affection, but when it came to same-sex love, especially between women, it didn't even bother to name it in the law. Legally, female homosexuality didn't exist. Parliament never criminalised it the way they did male relationships, and the reason why is both absurd and infuriating. Queen Victoria reportedly refused to believe such a thing was even possible. That little quirk of royal denial meant women could, technically, express affection more openly, holding hands, exchanging passionate letters, living together even, without always drawing suspicion. But don't let that fool you into thinking it was safe. Society may not have had legal language for their love, but it knew how to smother it all the same. You move closer to the parasol pair, pretending to admire the begonias, and catch a snippet of their conversation. It's not overt, of course. They're talking about a book. But when one of them says, "That character was so misunderstood," and the other replies, "I thought of you the entire time," it's clear what's really being said. Literature was often the only safe space for queer emotion, a mirror where they could see themselves without being named. Novels by women like Charlotte Bronte and George Eliot gave just enough ambiguity to allow a reader to slip their own truth between the lines. Behind you, a governess scolds a child for stepping on the lawn. You glance at her, a plain dress, hair pulled back, eyes tired. She too is part of the background, rarely noticed. But she might be another hidden story. Governesses often lived strange double lives, educated, refined, but socially rootless. Not quite servants, not quite gentlewomen. Many formed deep bonds with their female employers, or with each other, away from the eyes of men. And in some rare cases those bonds became something else, something forbidden, something beautiful. One such case involved two women who lived together for decades in what society politely called a Boston marriage. They were well off, shared a home, travelled together, and were known to refer to each other as beloved companions. The neighbours looked away. It was easier to pretend it was eccentricity than intimacy. But their letters, preserved and hidden until long after they were gone, tell a different story. Lines like, "Your absence is an ache I carry all day, and no one understands me but you." These were not the sentiments of roommates. You wonder, not for the first time, what it must have felt like to love someone you couldn't name, to live in a world where your feelings were invisible, not even scandalous, just unthinkable. There's a loneliness in that, a kind of erasure that cuts deeper than judgment. Because at least if people judge you, you exist to them. But if they can't even imagine your love, it's like you were never there. And yet, here they are. These two women under the parasol laughing, risking everything in the gentle arch of a wrist, the stolen glance, the soft echo of shared meaning. You start to notice others. A pair of ladies in matching brooches, a woman who lingers too long near the pianist, even the young widow who's turned down 3 suitors this season, preferring the company of her female companion. Are these all stories? Or are you just seeing what you want to see? That's the thing about hidden love. It trains you to read between the lines, to invent spaces where none are offered. Scholars still argue whether many of these relationships were romantic or platonic. But maybe that's missing the point. The feelings were real, whatever form they took, and they mattered, even if history didn't always care to record them. Nearby, a little girl plucks petals from a daisy, chanting the age-old rhyme, "He loves me not." You can't help but imagine someone else saying the words, quietly replacing he with she, fingers trembling, knowing it can never be said aloud. That's the quiet rebellion of it, using ordinary language to express extraordinary feeling. You shift in your seat and realise how much of Victorian life depended on silence. The silence of the unacknowledged, the unspoken, the unspeakable. There were no pride parades here, no declarations. Just whispers, shared books, glances in the dark, and even those could be dangerous. In 1870, a scandal broke involving 2 women who dared to be too public with their affection. They danced together at a ball, kissed behind a curtain, nothing more, but it was enough. They were separated by their families, one sent abroad, the other married off within a year. Letters burned, histories scrubbed, their names lost, except for a single diary entry that survived in a cousin's journal, calling it a tragic embarrassment. That was their epitaph. And yet, you know they were real. You feel them in this garden, in every cautious smile and coded compliment. They existed, whether history wrote them down or not. The women under the parasol rise and walk toward the tea table. As they pass you, one of them brushes the other's arm, brief, deliberate. It's a touch filled with the weight of all they can't say. And you feel it like a secret passed into your hands. In this world of corsets and constraints, these small moments are revolutions, soft rebellions, love that dares to exist, even if it can't speak its name. The house is quiet this evening, too quiet. The kind of hush that presses against the walls and makes candle flames flicker like they're listening in. You've slipped away from the parlour, away from the steady murmur of polite conversation and teacups clinking against saucers. You're on the upstairs landing now, the runner muffling your steps, and the corridor is dim except for the faint glow spilling from a room at the end of the hall. You shouldn't be here. But then again, most of the interesting things in this house happen where you're not supposed to be. You pause by the door, heart ticking a little faster. Inside, the young governess, Miss Elwood, is seated near the hearth. Her face is lit from below by the fire, which dances across the pages of the book in her lap. Across from her, standing with one arm resting on the mantel like he owns the whole world, which he sort of does, is Mr. Ashcombe, the master of the house. His expression is calm, but there's tension in his jaw, the kind that makes you feel like something is about to be said that shouldn't be. He asks her what she's reading. Her voice trembles just slightly as she says it's a volume of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. He steps closer, casually, like it means nothing, like this isn't the exact moment everything is about to shift. And there it is, the spark. Now you've seen this before. The slow-burning dance between a man of means and the young woman employed to teach his children. It's practically a Victorian trope, but you also know how dangerous it is, for her especially. A man like Mr. Ashcombe can risk a dalliance. It might make the rounds at his club or inspire knowing glances at the next dinner party, but it won't ruin him. Miss Elwood? One slip, one whispered rumour, and she's on the street with nothing but her worn-out shoes and a suitcase full of children's grammar primers. Still, she doesn't move away when he hands her a brandy from the sideboard. She sips it, cautiously, and you can't help but feel the room change. It's no longer warm and cosy, it's electric. Not in a seductive way, not yet. Just charged. Like both of them are aware of the line and how easily it might be crossed. This situation wasn't uncommon. In homes across England, young educated women were hired to raise and teach children, often isolated from the family, but not so distant from the man of the house. They lived in awkward half-status, above the servants, but never equal to the family, too refined to socialise downstairs, too low to dine upstairs. Loneliness was practically baked into the job, which made affection, any affection, a lifeline. There are countless entries in real Victorian diaries where governesses describe accidental touches, stolen glances, and the unbearable longing of being close to someone who sees you, who really sees you, in a world that barely lets you exist. But here's the fringe twist for tonight. In some households, it went the other way around. There were rare, whispered stories of governesses who charmed their way into marriage, or inheritance, or both. One case involved a young woman who, after years of teaching the children, suddenly became the lady of the house following the mysterious death of the previous mistress. Poison? Scandal? No one proved a thing. But the staff said her smile changed after that. Back in the room, Mr. Ashcombe asks Miss Elwood if she's ever thought of leaving service. Her answer is careful. Too careful. She says she's content where she is. You can almost hear the unspoken ending of that sentence. For now. He leans closer. You feel your breath catch. He brushes a curl from her forehead. It lingers. It's the kind of moment that teeters on the edge. One word, one gesture, and it would tip into something else entirely. But instead, she closes her book and stands. She says goodnight, and he, after a pause long enough to leave a bruise, nods. The moment doesn't collapse, it folds into itself, packed away like a letter never sent. You slip away before she sees you, back down the hall, back into the polite chaos of evening tea. No one down here knows what just nearly happened upstairs, and maybe they never will. That's the secret of the governess affair. So many of them weren't affairs at all. They were almost affairs. Maybe affairs. Emotional entanglements with no real outlet. The slow suffocation of what if. And still, the consequences could be just as real. Even suspicion could be lethal to a woman's future. In one infamous case, a young governess was dismissed without reference after being seen too often in the presence of her employer. She hadn't even touched him, but perception was power. And once you lost your good name, there was no getting it back. There's still debate today among historians about whether these relationships were consensual, coercive, or simply the natural result of proximity and loneliness. Some argue that governesses had more power than we think, that they knew how to manipulate affections to secure protection. Others insist they were trapped, vulnerable, with no real choice but to tolerate emotional advances they couldn't afford to reject. You don't know Miss Elwood's story yet, not fully. Maybe she's cleverer than she lets on. Maybe she's in love. Or maybe she's playing the only card she has left in a house that doesn't even let her eat at the main table. Downstairs, someone's playing a waltz on the piano. Laughter floats up the stairwell. You wonder how many stories like this are happening right now, in rooms like this, all over the country. How many governesses are catching their breath at the sound of a man's footsteps? How many masters are staring into the fire, wrestling with the thing they can't have? And how many never act, but never forget? Because some love affairs don't happen in bedsheets or locked studies. Some unfold in glances, in poems read too slowly, in hands brushed accidentally on purpose, in silences, and the echo of what might have been. You're sitting on the cold stone ledge of a window in the East Wing, the kind of place that hasn't been dusted in months and smells faintly of old ink and lavender water. This is the forgotten corner of the house, where trunks are stored, letters are lost, and secrets find somewhere to sleep. In your hands you hold a letter. The paper is soft with age, and the writing, scrawled in an anxious looping hand, is just barely legible. The words aren't signed, but the passion in them doesn't need a name. You read it aloud under your breath the way one might whisper a spell, "I cannot speak to you in daylight." But your silence stabs me. I saw you with her. Say it wasn't real. Say she means nothing. You pause, fold it up. There are dozens more in the same box, bound with a faded blue ribbon and a sprig of dried lavender that crumbles the moment you touch it. Letters like this weren't rare in Victorian England. What was rare was keeping them. You were supposed to burn things like this, destroy the evidence, seal the story with wax and silence. But someone, somewhere, couldn't bear to let them go. It makes you think about the art of secret communication. In an era when people couldn't say what they meant out loud, or at least not to the person they meant it to, they got creative. Letters became lifelines. Love wasn't spoken, it was smuggled. The Victorians were absurdly good at hiding things in plain sight. Lemon juice ink was just the start. Yes, really. People wrote letters using lemon juice as invisible ink, revealing the message only when the paper was gently warmed near a candle flame. Of course, that also risks setting your undying love on fire, but hey, love's nothing without a little danger. Another favourite trick? Writing between the lines. Literally. Lovers would write a respectable letter in dark ink, and then use a fine pen to squeeze in secret lines between the margins, using pale grey or blue ink, barely visible unless held to the light. You think of someone holding a letter at the right angle near the window, heart pounding, trying to decode something that could ruin them forever. Some went further. There's a recorded case of a lady hiding love notes inside hollowed-out knitting needles, passed during chaperoned visits. Another involved a footman who hid letters in the pages of a Bible in the guest bedroom. He'd nudge the book slightly off its shelf to signal that something new was hidden inside. A whole espionage system built just for the sake of expressing what they weren't allowed to feel. And of course, flower code. You're sure you've heard of it, floriography, as it was dramatically called. It wasn't just a game, it was an entire romantic language. A bouquet could confess love, declare anger, or signal betrayal. Red tulips meant declaration of love, daisies for innocence, sweet peas to say goodbye. Imagine standing at a ball, having someone hand you a cluster of heliotrope, meaning eternal love, and knowing, without a word, exactly what they meant. You brush dust from your coat and lean back against the stone wall, letting your mind wander to one such couple, a seamstress and her patron. He couldn't be seen with her, she wasn't suitable, but they wrote, hundreds of times apparently. She kept every note under a loose floorboard beneath her work table. When she died, the letters were found, but the man had long since vanished. Some say he never stopped writing, that he buried his last letter in the cemetery where she was buried, tucked beneath the roots of a willow tree. Romantic, sure. Slightly unhinged, also yes. But that's what love did in this world. It bent people out of shape, turned the rational into the reckless, and made the respectable act like spies. You glance down the hall to make sure no one's coming. Then you fish out another letter from the box. This one's written in French. You can barely translate half of it, but the tone is unmistakable. Longing, desperation. A question repeated 3 times in different forms. Do you still think of me? What strikes you is not the language but the length. This one's nearly 5 pages, written tightly edge to edge. The person who wrote it didn't have much paper, or maybe they didn't want anyone to find multiple sheets. Either way, they were determined to say everything they couldn't say in person. Some scholars argue that Victorian society's obsession with letter writing was its saving grace, that without it, no one would have been able to express anything real. You start to believe it. Without these letters, most of these affairs would have evaporated like steam, lost to time. But because someone put pen to paper, because someone risked writing it down, they left behind echoes, proof, emotion made tangible. Others disagree, saying letters were a trap, that they bound people to impossible ideals, encouraged romantic delusions, and made longing linger far longer than it should. But you think that's missing the point. These weren't just notes, they were revolutions, tiny acts of resistance in a world that preferred silence. There's one final letter in the box, folded tightly and sealed with black wax. Unusual, since black wax was typically used for mourning. You break it, heart beating louder than you'd like, and unfold the note. This one is short. 7 words, nothing else. Don't answer. I will always know. You sit there for a long time, staring at the paper. It's not a plea. It's not even a farewell. It's a promise. The kind of promise people in this era had to make when they couldn't make anything else. Not vows, not declarations, just this quiet knowing. that someone, somewhere, loved them back. You place the letter gently back in the box, retie the ribbon, and close the lid. The room feels different now, as if someone else has been breathing there with you. Someone who left this piece of their soul in paper and ink. And as you walk back down the hall, back toward the noise and light of the living world, you realise something important. In Victorian England, the most powerful affairs didn't happen in beds. They happened in margins, in metaphors, in the invisible ink only two people could read. You're riding in a carriage now, wooden wheels clattering over uneven cobblestones as gaslights flicker against the damp fog outside. The city smells like soot, rain, and horse sweat, but your mind is somewhere else entirely, inside a much messier, riskier story than the parlours and poetry of high society. This isn't about the polished, rule-bending love of whispered sonnets and lemon-ink letters. No, tonight, we're heading straight into a collision of class and consequence. The carriage slows near a mews, tucked behind a row of grand townhouses. You step out, boots landing in a puddle, and glance around. No one follows. Good. The stable boy, Tom, is already there, hidden in the shadows near the lamplight, his shirt open at the throat and hair damp from the mist. He gives you a crooked smile, one part mischief and one part danger. He's young, handsome, and absolutely the worst possible person for the Duke's daughter to fall in love with. And yet, you're not her, of course. But tonight you'll see through her eyes, the heavy velvet of her gown, the pounding of her heart as she slips out the back gate, breathless and terrified. She's 18, maybe 19, and she's had everything. Tutors, French lessons, embroidery circles, afternoon teas, everything except choice. She's been promised, no, traded, to a barren son since she was 14. It's a fine match, strategically sound, emotionally void. Tom, meanwhile, can barely read, sleeps in a shared loft above the stables and smells permanently of hay. But he listens when she talks. He laughs at her jokes, not because they're clever, but because they're hers. And when he takes her hand, he does it like he's afraid the moment will be stolen from him, which, to be fair, it absolutely will. These kinds of relationships, crossing class lines, were the true scandals of the Victorian world. Not just because of the love itself, but because they threatened the system. Everything in this society was built on order. Nobility above gentry, gentry above the merchant class, everyone above servants, and romance was a dangerous equalizer. You slip into the stable with them, where it's warm, dark, and alive with the scent of animals and earth. They talk in whispers, knowing the thin walls have ears. He shows her a secret spot behind a stack of feed bags where they can sit unseen. She's shaking, partly from nerves, partly from excitement, and partly because she knows this is the only place she ever truly feels real. What they have isn't sustainable. It's thrilling, yes. It's the kind of love that makes you believe in poetry and riots. But the clock is ticking. Her father will find out. They always do. And when he does, it won't be a stern talking to. It'll be social exile for her, unemployment, and probably a beating for Tom, and the quiet, crushing silence of a secret buried under the weight of what will people think. One historical case almost mirrors this exactly. In 1859, a young noblewoman was discovered to be meeting regularly with the family's footman. Her father had him sent to Australia under false charges of theft, because transportation was a tidy way to disappear someone. She was locked in her room for 2 months and then married off to a widower twice her age. That was her story. Love, punishment, silence. And yet, for every story like that, there are others. Fringe cases, rare but real, where people manage to rewrite the ending. There's a record of a kitchen maid who married a wealthy merchant's son in Liverpool after he fell in love with her over 3 years of midnight snacks and borrowed books. The family disowned him, of course, but he went on to start his own business, make his own money, and bring her back to dine in the very hotel where his parents once entertained the gentry. Petty? Maybe. Satisfying? Deeply. But even those happy stories came at a cost. Because the truth is, class wasn't just about money. It was about language, posture, references, blood. It was coded into every part of life, from how you held your fork to how you pronounced schedule. Love didn't just cross a social line, it obliterated it, which is why the system fought back so hard. You watch Tom brush a strand of hay from the girl's sleeve, fingers trembling just slightly. She leans in, resting her forehead against his. Neither of them says it, not aloud. Saying "I love you" would break the spell, make it too real, too exposed, so they let the silence hold it instead. A silence thick with everything unsaid. Outside, the church bells toll midnight. She flinches. Time's up. They part quickly, no kiss, just a brief squeeze of fingers and the kind of eye contact that holds on long after the moment passes. She disappears into the dark. He stays behind, hands shoved in his pockets, staring at the space where she'd just stood. You follow her back to the house, ducking behind hedges, heart racing. She slips in through a servant's entrance and tiptoes up the servant's staircase, even though it's not hers. Tonight she doesn't care. Her room is cold, her shoes are wet, but her heart is still burning. She'll marry the Baron's son, of course. That's how these things go. He'll smell faintly of pipe smoke and entitlement, and she'll learn to sit beside him at dinner and smile politely when he talks about horse racing and tax reform. But there will always be this night, this boy, this version of herself that felt alive and full and brave. And years from now, when she's sitting in a parlour filled with ticking clocks and pointless chatter, she'll remember it. Not with regret exactly, but with a kind of ache. Because loving someone you're not supposed to love doesn't just change your life, it changes you. Scholars still argue about whether these stories should be considered romantic or tragic. Some see them as moments of true rebellion, love in its purest form, untainted by expectation. Others view them as cautionary tales where emotional risk meets societal cruelty. You think maybe they're both, romantic and tragic, reckless and necessary. Proof that even in a world built on rules, the heart has its own agenda. The next morning, the stables look exactly the same, but everything is different, because someone loved someone they shouldn't have, and for a moment, it mattered more than all the rules in the world. It's late afternoon now, and the sun cuts long, golden slants through the dusty windows of a modest sitting room. You're not in a manor house this time, or even a respectable middle-class residence. You're somewhere quieter, smaller, quaint, if you're being generous. Books pile up along the walls, there's a faint smell of rosewater and ink. A fireplace burns low even though it's spring. And seated in 2 armchairs near the window, framed by heavy drapes and silence, are Miss Caroline and Miss Lydia, close friends of course. Everyone knows that. No one questions it. They live together, have for nearly 7 years. The arrangement is practical, they say, sensible. Neither of them ever married, so why not pool their modest incomes and share a household? It's not that unusual. Spinsters must support one another after all. But you watch them now as one pours tea for the other, adding 2 cubes of sugar without asking, and you know this isn't about practicality. Not entirely. Miss Lydia brushes a loose thread from Caroline's sleeve and holds her hand there just a moment too long. It's tender, practiced, not the clumsy curiosity of a new affection, but the deep, warm rhythm of years spent loving someone quietly. These women have built an entire life together in the margins. They host literary evenings every Thursday, filled with other unmarried women. They read poetry, debate novels, and occasionally someone plays the piano badly. From the outside, it all looks wonderfully innocent, cultured, a touch eccentric, but from the inside, it's sanctuary. Because this salon, as they cheekily call it, is more than an excuse for socializing. It's a cover, a safe place, a shield against the world that doesn't have language for what they are to each other. It's the one space where women can express something resembling emotional truth, sometimes veiled in verse, sometimes in eye contact held just a moment too long. And in this room, you start to understand the quiet power of female companionship in a society obsessed with male authority. The Victorians were terrified of unsupervised women, and for good reason. Give them a room to themselves and they might write novels, organise revolutions, or heaven forbid fall in love with one another. They called these pairings romantic friendships. Letters between women from this time are drenched in florid devotion. My dearest love, your absence pains me. I ache for the sound of your voice. Many of these women insisted the relationships were chaste, and maybe some were. But others were clearly something more. There's an actual historical example that comes to mind. Anne Lister, sometimes referred to as Gentleman Jack. She kept coded diaries about her love affairs with women, detailed and unapologetic. She dressed in black, walked with confidence, inherited property, and even had a symbolic wedding with her partner Anne Walker, decades before the world had any framework for what that meant. Some scholars say she lived openly, others argue she was simply too wealthy to be punished. Either way, her life was a quiet rebellion in starched collars and ink-stained fingers. But unlike Lister, most women didn't write their truth. They buried it in metaphors, they lived it in glances across a tea table, they survived on crumbs of privacy. Miss Caroline hands Lydia a book, spine-worn and pages dog-eared. It's a volume of Christina Rossetti's poetry. You recognise it immediately. Gorgeous, melancholy, thick with emotion. They begin reading aloud, trading verses in low, steady voices. One poem in particular catches you. I loved you first, but afterwards your love. The words hang in the room like smoke. No one dares speak. Not really. And here's something quirky. Some women in these arrangements would wear mourning jewellery for one another when one passed, just as a wife might for her husband. A locket of hair, a ring with initials. And since society couldn't imagine romantic love between two women, no one questioned it. Which is strangely freeing and deeply tragic all at once. To be invisible is to be unchallenged, but also to be unseen. You shift your weight slightly and the floorboard creaks. Both women look up sharply, and for a moment you feel the protective shell around them. This is not a space made for strangers. This is a space carved out through necessity, built on trust and shared silence. They relax when they see you mean no harm. Lydia smiles slightly and pours you tea. It's lukewarm but sweet. You sit in silence with them, letting the fire crackle and the poem speak louder than any of you will. The air is thick with safety but also grief. Because as stable as this domestic setup may seem, it exists on borrowed time. If either of them dies, the other may be evicted. No inheritance rights, no legal standing. If one is hospitalized, the other can't make decisions. They are roommates, companions, devoted friends. Society might tolerate them, but it won't protect them. And they know it. Scholars still debate the nature of these pairings. Were they romantic, sexual, just close emotional bonds in a time when women had limited outlets? Some argue that we're projecting modern labels onto relationships that were, by necessity, ambiguous. Others say the ambiguity was the very point. It was survival. The slipperiness of definition is what kept these women safe. You think again of Anne Lister's coded diaries and wonder how many other women did the same, writing truths in ciphers, carving initials into the spines of shared books, loving within boundaries that shifted constantly but never fully broke. Caroline reaches for Lydia's hand again just for a second. No one comments, no one blinks. It's the most natural thing in the world, here in this room. And maybe that's the miracle of it, that even in a world built to suppress them, they still found each other, still built lives, imperfect, fragile, quiet lives, together. As the shadows lengthen and the fire burns low, the poetry reading winds down. No declarations are made, no kisses stolen. But something passes between them, something that doesn't need to be spoken, the kind of love that doesn't always need a name, just space, a room, a little silence. You stand to go. Lydia sees you to the door, her hand brushing your arm gently, almost in thanks, and as you step back into the noisy, coded, repressed world outside, you carry a part of their silence with you. Because in a society that insisted their love didn't exist, they lived it anyway. The room is heavy with cigar smoke and the low rumble of male voices. You're not supposed to be here. Technically, you shouldn't even be allowed inside without a title and a mustache. But tonight, you're a shadow in the corner of a London gentleman's club, tucked behind a velvet curtain near the billiard table. Everything smells of tobacco, leather, and self-importance. You can practically taste the brandy in the air. The lamps burn low, casting golden halos over tufted chairs and polished oak. And around you, a collection of respectable men unwind in the most respectable way possible, by absolutely losing their composure in whispers and whiskey. This is where secrets come to stretch their legs. It starts as harmless chatter, political banter, complaints about the Irish, something about the railroads. One man, middle-aged, round-bellied and drunker than he should be, makes an offhand joke about how some women dress like men these days, and the room bursts into chuckles. Then someone else, leaner, sharper, with eyes that never stop scanning, mutters, "Some men do too." The laughter pauses, shifts, becomes a little more measured, a little more tense. You lean in. This isn't a conversation for just anyone. These clubs, these sacred havens of masculinity, were ironically the only places where men sometimes felt safe enough to say what they couldn't anywhere else. Not in the drawing room, not at church, not even in their own homes. The world outside demanded performance. Husbands, fathers, employers. Inside these walls the lines blurred. Here, between the decanters and cigar ash, the unspeakable sometimes got whispered. One man, younger than the rest and fidgeting with his cufflink, leans forward and says, "He wrote me a poem. Said I reminded him of a Greek statue." The others laugh, not cruelly, but nervously. Someone replies, "Well, I've never seen a Greek statue that blushed." And then there's a pause, a long, thoughtful silence, as though they're all recalibrating. It's a joke, sure, but it's also not. You know what they're talking about, even if they won't say it outright. Homosexuality in Victorian England was not just taboo, it was criminal. Specifically, gross indecency, as laid out in Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. The wording was intentionally vague. It didn't require proof of sex, just suggestion. Innuendo, a letter, a hand held too long. And it was this law that would eventually bring down Oscar Wilde, a man whose wit dazzled high society, but whose private life, once exposed, was turned into a public spectacle and cautionary tale. Wilde once said, "The love that dare not speak its name," and in this room, you feel the full weight of what that means. It isn't that love can't exist, it's that the language to describe it has been outlawed. You watch as the conversation shifts again. Another man, a widower, says quietly, "My tailor knows more about me than my late wife ever did." He says it with a laugh, but there's no mirth in it. The others nod subtly. No one presses. These are not men standing at the edge of rebellion. These are not revolutionaries. They are tired, cautious. Some are merely curious. Others are quietly suffocating. A few are just trying to name something they don't fully understand. But in this moment, they're all holding space for each other, and that, in this rigid, rule-bound society, is quietly radical. You notice something strange. There's a man at the bar who hasn't spoken once. Tall, quiet, neat as a pin. He drinks water, not whiskey. The bartender speaks to him with unusual deference. When the others laugh or argue, he doesn't join in, but every so often one of them glances at him, like he's some kind of fixed point. Eventually someone addresses him directly. "You ever had a friend like that, Charles?" He sets his glass down, clears his throat. "I had a friend once," he says. "He was the only person who ever knew the real me. We used to go fishing together, walk the downs in winter. He never asked questions, just listened. It was a relief." That's all he says. But the silence afterward feels like a confession. There's something strange about these moments, how they can be both heartbreakingly small and impossibly heavy. A few words, an unfinished sentence, a memory of walking with someone in the cold, and suddenly you're in the heart of a love story that never got told. And sometimes they didn't even get that. Take the case of Edward Ned Warren, an American art collector living in Britain. He amassed one of the largest collections of classical male nudes in Europe, all while living with his partner, John Marshall, in a bachelor arrangement. The art world turned a blind eye to the romantic nature of their partnership, preferring to view their shared life through the lens of artistic collaboration. Warren wrote love poems, but never published them. They died together. Their letters, if any survived, never saw the light of day. Some scholars claim these clubs were places of deep repression, where men cloaked their desires in irony and alcohol. Others argue they were the only place men could touch the edges of emotional honesty without risking ruin. You sit with that contradiction now, as one man lights another's cigar with an ease that feels both ordinary and intimate. In a world obsessed with defining love through marriage and lineage, the Victorian male affair, emotional, physical, or somewhere in between, was forced to live in half-light, in double meanings, in coded poems, in whispers shared between sips of brandy and smoke rings. Eventually the talk turns back to safer ground. Horses, the stock market, a particularly disappointing roast duck at a recent dinner. But the shift feels performative, like slipping a mask back on after letting it slide for just a moment. The club begins to thin out. Men don coats, nod farewells, and disappear into the fog outside. You linger a moment longer, watching Charles, the quiet man, tuck something into his coat pocket before leaving. It's a small notebook, bound in cracked leather. You wonder how many names are inside, how many unspoken histories are sealed between those covers. And as you step back into the cold night, you can't help thinking that some of the most heartbreaking love stories of this era didn't end in tragedy because they were caught, but because they were never allowed to begin. The rain drums steadily against the roof of your cabin as the ship cuts through the churning waters of the Atlantic. You lean against the porthole, watching waves slap the hull like they're trying to pull the whole thing back. It's cold, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and doesn't leave even when you're wrapped in a wool coat. You're a passenger aboard the RMS Arcadia, one of the many vessels ferrying British officers, administrators, and their carefully packed baggage across the Empire. India, Africa, the West Indies. The sun may never set on the British Empire, but love certainly has a way of going missing at sea. In the cramped dining room, where the silverware rattles with every swell, a captain is seated next to a young woman in an emerald green dress. She's clearly not his wife. She's also clearly not his companion. Her laughter is warm, a little too loud, and she rests her hand on his forearm in a way that suggests this is not the first time they've shared a table or a cabin. The other passengers pretend not to notice. That's the rule at sea. Anything that happens between ports is treated like fog. It lifts eventually, and everyone pretends it was never there. That's the theme of tonight's voyage. Affairs that flourished not in English gardens or drawing rooms, but across oceans, beneath palm trees, and under colonial ceilings far from the eyes of mothers-in-law and morning-room curtains. The British Empire may have been built on order, but its outer territories became a playground for those escaping social expectations, and not always willingly. You see, many of these men were posted abroad for years at a time, often without their wives, and in the distance between London and Lagos, or Calcutta or Jamaica, something shifted. Back home, they were husbands, colonels, dignified men in top hats. But out here, they were lonely, bored, occasionally drunk, and surrounded by women who were not their wives. Some of those women were British, other officers' wives, widows, missionaries, or governesses trying to make a new life. Others were local, caught in a deeply complicated web of power and desire. Some were seduced, some were coerced. Some, undoubtedly, played the game to their advantage. But the power imbalance was undeniable. You recall a real historical example. James, an East India Company officer stationed near Madras, entered into a temporary marriage with a local woman named Meera. Their relationship lasted 8 years. They had 2 children, and when he was recalled to England, he left them all behind. Never wrote, never sent for them. Just vanished into his proper English life like it had all been a strange colonial dream. This wasn't rare. It was practically routine. In fact, by the mid-19th century, the British colonial administration was so uncomfortable with the number of unofficial unions between Englishmen and local women that policies were introduced to encourage officers to marry properly, meaning white, English, and preferably titled. Entire campaigns were launched to import eligible women to colonial outposts like India and Singapore, giving rise to the grimly nicknamed fishing fleet. Waves of young women shipped abroad in hopes of catching a husband. Imagine it. A voyage halfway across the world just to end up in a drawing room in Rangoon, sipping tepid tea and pretending your husband isn't spending his nights somewhere else. You step back into the hallway, where the captain and the woman from dinner have just disappeared into his cabin. The crew steps aside politely, eyes averted. No one dares speak, but the tension is everywhere. And this isn't about scandal, it's about survival. For many women abroad, romantic entanglement, even a scandalous one, was the only path to security. Love was a luxury. Companionship was currency. And it wasn't just the officers. You hear murmurs of a ship's nurse and a merchant's wife sharing long evenings on the deck, wrapped in shawls and secrets. Some say they just enjoyed each other's company. Others say they were caught once, hands tangled in the laundry room. There was a transfer, a letter from someone's husband. Nothing proven. But again, fog. It lifts. It vanishes. Historians today debate these colonial love affairs endlessly. Some call them shameful relics of imperialism, grossly imbalanced, exploitative by design. Others argue that within the mess there were real relationships, genuine affection, even love that crossed boundaries in ways the world wasn't ready to see. You wonder if both can be true, that something could be wrong in its foundation and still real in its feeling. You climb the stairs to the upper deck, where the night wind hits like a slap. The sky is low, heavy with clouds, and the stars are hidden. You think about how many lives were changed aboard ships like this, not by war or conquest, but by love, by need, by the unbearable space between loneliness and longing. One story comes to mind. A married woman sent with her husband to a remote outpost in Nigeria. Her letters home, discovered much later in an attic, tell the story of an affair with a fellow officer's wife. The two women gardened together, took long walks, shared books. Their families thought them devoted friends. Until one night they were caught. One of their children wandered into the wrong room and saw what shouldn't have been seen. One was sent back to England, the other vanished, no charges, no records, just fog. And still, the stories drift back like messages in bottles, hushed, weather-worn, half-told. You think of all the women and men who kissed someone goodbye on these decks, knowing they'd return to a world that didn't want to hear what they had to say. The rain picks up, the ship groans beneath your feet, and you brace against the railing. Below, someone is playing a violin in the lounge, badly but earnestly. You think about how far people travelled just to feel something real, and how often they left pieces of themselves behind. And when you finally return to your own cabin, cold and a little damp, you sit by the porthole and look out into the night. Somewhere out there, between the stars and the black water, are all the forgotten lovers of the Empire, all the what-ifs and should-nots, all the stories written in waves and erased by distance, and you wonder, not for the first time, how much of Empire was built not on gold or maps, but on people choosing to love where they weren't supposed to. The air smells faintly of turpentine, candle wax, and something older. Linseed oil, maybe, or charcoal dust. You're standing in the cramped attic studio of a London painter, whose name you probably wouldn't recognise today, but whose portrait work once earned quiet praise in elite circles. The windows are tall but grimy, diffusing the light into a soft, forgiving haze that wraps the room in a permanent twilight. Half-finished canvases lean against the walls, some of them nothing more than outlines, others with eyes too lifelike to be entirely comfortable. At the centre of it all is a man in a paint-smeared coat, pacing in front of an easel, brushing sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. And seated before him, immaculate posture, hands folded delicately in her lap, is his muse. Her name is Eleanor, or at least that's what he calls her. It might not be her real name. These kinds of relationships tend to exist in a space between truth and performance. You can see her corset biting into her ribs, the pale skin of her neck exposed in a way that's just scandalous enough to sell, but not so scandalous that her father would come storming in with a cane and a threat. She's not a model, not officially. She's posing for a portrait because her family's patronising the artist, or at least pretending to. The money moves, of course, but not through official channels. He studies her now, brush held mid-air, eyes scanning every line of her face. There's tension in his jaw, not artistic frustration, something else. Desire? Obsession? Maybe a mix of both. Eleanor looks away, but not before the corner of her mouth tightens into the ghost of a smile. This isn't their first session. Affairs between artists and their sitters weren't uncommon in the Victorian era. In fact, they were almost a cliché, particularly in the increasingly bohemian art circles of London's Bloomsbury or Chelsea districts. But outside those liberal bubbles, the implications were dangerous. A woman sitting alone for a man with a brush. That was more than enough to spark rumours. Even if no one touched anyone, reputations could smear faster than oil paint in summer, and yet they came. Young women from good families, widows, actresses, bored wives. They sat for hours, week after week, not just for the final image, but for the intimacy of being seen. Really seen. Because in this room, away from the chaperones and tea parties, there were no scripts. Just gaze and gesture, breath and brush stroke. You wander through the studio as he paints, noting the portraits lining the walls. A girl in blue, eyes too sad for her age. A man with his face turned away. A woman in red silk, hand at her throat like she's holding something in. Each canvas tells its own story, but you can tell which ones were painted with affection, and which with obligation. Eleanor's painting, half-finished though it is, already hums with tension. Her likeness is delicate, sure, but there's something else in her eyes on the canvas. Something the painter has no right to know, and yet somehow does. In one corner of the room sits a tea tray, untouched. The kettle's gone cold. No one cares. Time moves differently here. You glance out the window and see that the lamplighters are already at work below, tipping flames into glass as the city begins to exhale the day. Upstairs, the studio breathes slower. Eleanor finally shifts, uncrossing and recrossing her ankles. He lowers his brush. "Break?" he asks. She nods, and he steps toward her with a rag in one hand, wiping paint from his fingers. Their conversation is quiet, the way it always is at the beginning of something dangerous. You catch bits and pieces, mentions of Paris, of exhibitions, of how terribly long winter has felt. But underneath it all, there's that quiet hum, that you and me against the world sort of vibration that always seems to accompany affairs that start in enclosed spaces. It's not hard to imagine where this is headed, and history offers plenty of precedent. One of the most famous painter-muse relationships of the period involved Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Elizabeth Siddal. She was his model, his muse, and eventually his wife. But their story wasn't romantic in the conventional sense. Siddal suffered illness, depression, and isolation, as her identity was swallowed by the very image Rossetti crafted of her. When she died of a laudanum overdose, he buried a volume of his poems in her coffin. Then, in a moment of wild regret and ambition, had her exhumed years later to retrieve them. That's Victorian romance for you. Tortured, gothic, and occasionally exhumed. Eleanor is not Siddal, at least not yet. But you wonder how many women like her sat in rooms like this, being transformed into something else entirely, an image, a subject, a fantasy. And how many artists mistook that transformation for affection? Of course, not all of them did. Some relationships were genuine partnerships, built on shared passion and creative vision. But even then, the power imbalance was hard to ignore. He holds the brush. She holds still. He chooses how she is seen. She hopes she's seen at all. There's an argument to be made, scholars still bicker about it, that these affairs were less about love and more about control. That the canvas became a kind of cage. Others argue the opposite, that it was the one place where a woman could escape control, sit still, yes, but on her terms, reveal herself through posture, gaze, presence. Eleanor certainly seems to know what she's doing. She meets the artist's eyes now, deliberately, and something passes between them. Not just attraction, power, shared, for the briefest moment. He steps away, picks up his brush, begins to paint again, but slower this time, more carefully, as if the act itself is sacred. You wonder if they'll kiss after the session, if they already have, if they ever will. Maybe they'll part ways after the final sitting, never speaking again. Or maybe he'll ask her to come to Paris, and she'll say yes. Maybe she'll disappear into his art, or maybe she'll marry a baron next spring and keep this chapter locked away like a pressed flower in a book. Because that's the thing about painter-muse affairs in this era. They almost never ended cleanly. Someone always paid, with reputation, with grief, with anonymity. One of them would move on, and the other would live on in pigment, staring forever from a canvas, known but never quite known. Eleanor settles back into her pose. The light shifts again, golden now, kissing her cheekbone just right. He leans forward. Their eyes meet, and the world disappears around them. Just canvas and colour and longing that won't dry. You're climbing narrow stairs now, the kind that creak on every third step no matter how delicately you tread. The walls are close, painted in faded floral wallpaper curling at the seams, and you can smell the lingering perfume of old jasmine water and coal smoke. At the top of the landing, behind a door with a brass number 3, lives someone you wouldn't find on the official guest list of Victorian society. You knock, pause, then push the door open. Inside is the domain of a kept woman. Not a wife, not a servant, not even a secret fiancée. She's what polite society refers to only in hushed tones. A mistress. A woman financed by a man with more money than loyalty. Kept in a respectable enough apartment that no one asks too many questions as long as she doesn't answer them. You take in the room. It's smaller than you expected, but lush in a strange, heavy way. Velvet curtains, brocade cushions, gold-framed mirrors. A little excessive, but always tasteful enough to pretend. The woman herself, Isabel, is seated on a chaise, her slippers kicked off, robe loose around her shoulders, smoking a thin cigarette from a crystal holder. She doesn't look startled to see you. In fact, she doesn't even look up right away. When she does, her gaze is calm, calculating, amused. "Curious," she says, tapping ash into a porcelain dish. Most people only come here when they want something. You're not most people. You're here to understand. Being a mistress in Victorian England wasn't just about satin sheets and secret rendezvous. It was an institution, a strange, shadowy corner of society where women who didn't, or couldn't, fit into respectable roles carved out power from the margins. And Isabel? She knows exactly what she's doing. She didn't grow up rich. Her hands are too practiced, too quick with teacups and hems. Maybe she started as a maid, maybe a shop girl. There are dozens of paths to becoming a kept woman, and none of them are straightforward. What they all share, though, is a moment, a glance, an invitation, a man with money, a woman with nothing to lose, and a system that leaves very little in between. Isabel pours you tea without asking how you take it. It's strong, slightly bitter, with just a hint of citrus. Everything about her is like that. Controlled, elegant, a little sad around the edges. She doesn't tell you who he is. She doesn't have to. His presence is everywhere. A silver brush set on the vanity. A silk dressing gown slung over the armchair. A bottle of expensive French perfume that hasn't been opened. It's not love, but it is comfort. And comfort in this world is a rare luxury. Here's where it gets interesting. Victorian men weren't exactly secretive about keeping mistresses. In fact, it was something of an open secret among the elite. They had wives for public life and heirs, and mistresses for, well, everything else. There were even etiquette rules about it. Mistresses were expected to dress well, but not too well, to be seen, but never too often, to accept gifts, but not presume a future. And in return, they were granted independence few women could dream of. Apartments, allowances, sometimes even their own carriages. Some became minor celebrities, objects of fascination and envy, but only for as long as they were useful. When the affair ended, when the man grew bored or his wife became suspicious, the mistress was expected to disappear, quietly, graciously, preferably without causing a scene. Isabel knows this. She's already planning for it. She's got a bank account in her own name, rare, but not impossible with the right help. She's stashing money in a box beneath the floorboards, saving for a little shop somewhere by the coast. Millinery, she says with a smile, men never stay, but hats always sell. And here's the strange part. Some of these women were happy. Not all, of course. Some were trapped, manipulated, left destitute when their patrons vanished. But others, they thrived in the shadows. Not quite wives, not quite free, but still navigating life on their own terms. There's a famous case. Cora Pearl, one of the most notorious courtesans in 19th century France who occasionally travelled to London. She bathed in milk, wore diamonds in her hair, and once appeared at a masquerade ball nearly nude, painted gold. She was scandalous, yes, but also powerful, richer than some of her lovers. She was the exception, not the rule, but she proved that women in this role could, on occasion, flip the dynamic. Isabel isn't Cora Pearl, she's not rolling in rubies, but she has what she needs, for now, and she's keenly aware of how temporary it all is. She shows you a small locket, hidden in her desk drawer. Inside is a portrait of her sister and niece. They think I'm a lady's companion in Bath, she says, not bitterly. Just fact. It's better that way. You ask if she ever loved him. The patron, the man who keeps her in all this shadowed silk and subtle luxury. She thinks about it for a long moment, then shrugs. I loved being warm in winter, she says. I loved not skipping dinner. Then, after another pause, I loved how he looked at me once, before I became an obligation. Scholars argue about this arrangement all the time. Some insist mistresses were nothing more than victims of a predatory system. Others paint them as savvy operators, manipulating desire into survival. The truth, as always, lives in between. For many women, it wasn't about seduction. It was about not starving, about not marrying the village butcher because your father owed him money, about finding a crack in the system wide enough to slip through. Isabel finishes her cigarette and stubs it out with a graceful flick. The light through the curtain catches her face, softening the lines that have begun to form around her eyes. I'm not ashamed, she says, but I'm not proud either. And that's what stays with you as you leave. Not the perfume, not the whispered rumours, not even the velvet, but the in-betweenness of it. The way these women lived in a space that society refused to admit existed, making homes out of borrowed time, building lives from the offcuts of other people's stories. As you step back into the hallway, the door shuts softly behind you, and you realise she may be kept, but she is far from owned. You wake to the rattle of rain on the windows, grey light pressing in like a persistent solicitor who won't take a hint. Downstairs, the house creaks with the familiar rhythm of breakfast being prepared, footsteps on floorboards, a kettle shrieking, the low murmur of voices not quite sharp enough to eavesdrop on. It's a perfectly ordinary Victorian morning, except today you're thinking about marriage. Not the kind with rice and church bells and a lifetime of mutually agreed upon gardening. No, you're thinking about the kind of marriage that feels more like a well-decorated prison cell. Downstairs in the parlour, Mrs. Arabella March is seated on a rose-coloured sofa, straight-backed, sipping tea as if the cup might bite her if she lets her guard down. Her husband, Colonel March, is across the room, reading the Times, glasses perched low on his nose. He hasn't looked at her in 20 minutes. He hasn't spoken since breakfast. She doesn't seem to notice, or care. She's been married for 17 years, and at this point indifference feels like luxury. This is the Victorian ideal. Two people tied together not by passion or even affection, but by status, obligation, and an unspoken agreement to never mention how miserable they are. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about alliance, about inheritance, about survival, especially for women. Arabella didn't marry for happiness. She married because she was 23 and her father warned her that she was already fading. The Colonel had land, money, and enough hair to make a decent silhouette. That was enough. There was a dinner, a ring, a month in Brighton, then decades of carefully navigated distance. You wander the house, passing oil portraits of their children, all painted before the age of 12. The oldest is at boarding school. The youngest is visiting her aunt. But the truth is, Arabella doesn't remember the last time the entire family was in the same room for more than half an hour. The Colonel travels, a lot. He likes hunting trips, parliamentary sessions, any excuse to sleep somewhere else. Arabella doesn't mind. She has her garden, her novels, the housekeeper who's been with her since before the wedding and knows precisely how much sherry to pour on a bad day. She also has her own room, rare, but not impossible, and a lock on the inside of the door. Because here's the thing Victorian novels leave out. Marriage was often a trap. Once a woman said "I do," she effectively said goodbye to property rights, personal freedom, and in many cases her own children. Her husband controlled everything: finances, household decisions, even her right to see friends. Divorce, technically possible, realistically, catastrophic. It required an act of parliament and usually involved the woman being dragged through public scandal, labelled a fallen woman, and left with nothing. There's a case that still makes historians wince. Caroline Norton, a talented writer and socialite, left her abusive husband in 1836. He responded by taking custody of their children, cutting her off financially and suing the man he suspected she was involved with. Caroline never got her children back. But her relentless campaigning eventually led to the Custody of Infants Act in 1839 and, later, the Married Women's Property Act of 1870. Small victories, hard won, still left too many women stranded in loveless, legally binding arrangements. Back in the parlour, Arabella's face barely flickers as the Colonel folds his newspaper with a sigh and asks, "Anything from your sister?" She nods. She writes from Dover, says the sea air agrees with her. That's the extent of their conversation today, maybe this week. It's polite, respectable, bloodless. But not every marriage was icy. Some were just blank, lifeless. Two people coexisting like parallel train tracks, close enough to be seen, never close enough to touch. That doesn't mean affairs didn't happen. They did, constantly, quietly. You've already met some of the people involved: governesses, artists, stable boys. The difference is, for a married woman, the stakes were astronomical. If she was caught, she could lose everything: home, children, social standing. Meanwhile, her husband could take a mistress without so much as a raised eyebrow. There's a cruel kind of irony in it. Victorian society idolised female purity while offering men endless loopholes. A man could fall in love with a barmaid and still be considered decent. A woman who did the same was considered broken. There's even a medical term they love to throw around: female hysteria. One too many emotional outbursts and you were off to the sanitarium. Nothing says romantic freedom like being force-fed morphine and locked in a sunless room for wanting a divorce. And yet, some women found loopholes of their own. Arabella has one. You see it in the letter she tucks into her embroidery basket each morning. It's from someone named M, no address, no signature. Just careful, precise script and words that make her cheeks flush before she hides the page under a pile of needlework. They never mention love directly. That would be reckless. But the phrases are unmistakable. Your laughter is a rhythm I still carry with me. Or, I think of your garden, the way it curls around the walls like a secret. Who M is, you don't know. A former house guest? A friend from abroad? Possibly not a man at all. The letters don't specify. They never will. That's how Arabella keeps them safe. There's scholarly debate about how widespread emotional affairs like these really were. Some argue that most Victorian marriages were colder on the surface than in truth, that affection existed but was just disguised by formality. Others say people simply learned to live without love, numbing themselves with duty and distraction. You wonder if Arabella feels numb, or if the letters are enough to keep her warm, enough to keep her from becoming brittle like the rest of the furniture. You leave her there, in the parlour, where the clock ticks like it's counting down to something that will never arrive. The Colonel picks up his hat. She doesn't ask where he's going, he doesn't tell her. That's the rhythm, that's the understanding. And when the door closes behind him, she reaches for the letter in her embroidery basket, opens it, reads the same 3 lines again, slowly. This is what intimacy looks like in her world. Careful language, private pages, silence that carries meaning only she can hear. She smiles just slightly, and you realise that she may not be free, but she's found a sliver of rebellion in ink and paper. Sometimes that's all there is. It starts with a creak in the floorboards. Not the usual kind, not the gentle settling of an old house breathing through another damp evening, but a deliberate, almost human sound, like a footstep held too long. You're in an upstairs bedroom, though the bed hasn't been slept in for decades. The curtains hang limp, moth-bitten, and the dust is thick enough to write secrets in. You're not alone. Or rather, you're not the first person to have been here in secret. The boards near the hearth give way with a soft sigh, and there, beneath a loosened plank, is something tucked in oilcloth. A diary. It's small, with a cracked leather cover and a brass clasp that sticks before clicking open. Inside, the ink has faded, but the handwriting is sharp and furious, like someone wrote it with their jaw clenched and their heart halfway up their throat. The first page reads, "If anyone finds this, let it be known. I never regretted him. I only regret the silence." You're about to fall into someone else's love story, the kind that was never meant to be found. The entries stretch over nearly 20 years, and they're not romantic in the way you'd expect. They're messy, resentful, tender, defiant. Written by a woman, Mary Ann Bexley, who married a banker in 1848 and lived the rest of her life with her chin lifted too high and her voice too soft. But somewhere in those years, she met someone else. Not a scandalous stranger, not a stable boy or an artist. No, her lover was a married man, a friend of her husband's, in fact, someone who visited often, played cards in the study, discussed railway shares over brandy while Mary Ann poured the tea. You read the moment it begins. I dropped the saucer, he caught it, our fingers met. It was a cliché, but I couldn't breathe for hours after. She never names him, just refers to him as H, which somehow makes it worse, more intimate, more dangerous. Their affair wasn't physical for years, just conversations at garden parties, shared books, the occasional stolen hour in the conservatory. Mary Ann wrote everything down. The way he leaned in when he spoke, how he remembered her favourite Shakespeare sonnet, the way he lingered at the door, always seeming like he might say something real and never quite daring to. And then, finally, the first kiss came after the funeral. I shouldn't even write this down, but it happened, and the earth didn't open, and God didn't strike me down. It was raining. It always rains when something begins. You close the book and stare out the window. The rain has started again, just a fine mist, like the house is exhaling through the glass. Somewhere downstairs someone lights a fire, and the scent of burning coal reaches even up here. You open the diary again. You're not done. What's remarkable about Mary Ann's story isn't the affair, it's the persistence of it. These weren't fleeting encounters. She and H exchanged letters for years, hidden behind false envelopes, delivered through a trusted servant whose loyalty was never confirmed but never betrayed. The entries are thick with frustration, longing that couldn't be fulfilled because of children, duty, and the iron cage of reputation. They had moments, quiet dinners when spouses were away, summer afternoons in rented carriages, 2 nights in Paris when she pretended to be travelling with a cousin, and then, suddenly, it stopped. The entry is abrupt. He said it must end, that we were becoming reckless. I agreed, but not really. I said goodbye, but I wrote again 2 weeks later. He never answered. I saw him once on the Strand. He tipped his hat. That was all. No dramatic confrontation, no scandal, just a slow fade into silence. You find yourself angry for her, for how much she risked just to feel alive, and how easily he seemed to walk away. But you keep reading, because the story doesn't end with heartbreak. It shifts. Mary Ann writes not just about H, but about herself. What the affair made her realise. That she'd never been in love with her husband. That she liked who she became when she was with H. Funny, bold, opinionated. She took to writing poems. Nothing groundbreaking, but full of raw emotion. She submitted one anonymously to a local journal and saw it published. She even considered moving to the coast. Alone. But then her eldest child got engaged, and the dream folded quietly in a drawer. There's something heartbreakingly modern about the way she writes. My life has been very long, and most of it was spent watching someone else live it for me. And here's the odd fringe detail. Mary Ann died in 1892. Her obituary made no mention of her poetry, or her diary, or her affair, of course. But a century later the attic was cleared, and the diary was found. Some distant relative donated it to a small local museum, where it's kept in a glass case, mislabeled as Housewife's Journal 19th Century. No one's read it cover to cover, until now. Scholars have debated the value of such personal writings for decades. Some dismiss them as emotional clutter, unreliable, indulgent. Others see them as the only true record of women's inner lives during an era when everything public was filtered through a male lens. You fall in with the latter. Because this diary isn't just a confession, it's a rebellion, a resistance against the enforced silence of propriety. You place the book gently back in its cloth wrapping, hands tingling with the residue of someone else's courage. You're not sure what she wanted to happen by writing it all down. Maybe nothing. Maybe just to be remembered. To exist somewhere outside the confines of family portraits and guest lists. As you return the floorboard to its place, the house creaks again, almost approvingly, and you realise love stories like Mary Ann's didn't disappear. They were buried, hidden in attic corners, locked in drawers, folded into the margins of housekeeping journals, waiting to be read, waiting to be known. You're walking now slowly through the gravel-lined paths of an asylum garden, if you can call it a garden. The hedges are too neatly trimmed, the flower beds a little too sterile, and there's a silence here that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels imposed. Around you, the air hangs thick with the scent of damp soil and antiseptic, and somewhere in the distance, a piano plays a soft, wandering tune, like someone started a lullaby and then forgot how it ends. The building behind you is grey stone, cold and impersonal, with barred windows and heavy doors that require keys, not just doorknobs. The asylum is called Rosewood House, which is misleading. There are no roses, and the only wood inside is the splintering kind. You're here to visit someone who once loved the wrong person at the wrong time and paid the exact price society demanded. Her name is Clarissa. She's in her 30s now, though her chart says she arrived at 27. Committed by her husband. The reason? Exhibiting signs of hysteria and moral instability. The real reason, according to the nurse who sneaks you a glance over her shoulder, is that Clarissa fell in love with another man, and wrote about it. You meet her in a sitting room whitewashed and eerily quiet, except for the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Clarissa sits near the window, dressed in drab institutional grey, hair pulled tightly back. But her eyes are still very much alive. She watches you like she's trying to place you in a dream she half remembers. She doesn't speak right away. Neither do you. Because how do you start a conversation with someone who's been locked away not for madness but for passion? In Victorian England, lunacy was a flexible diagnosis. Too flexible. Women in particular were vulnerable to being declared insane for the most nebulous of reasons. Reading too many novels, questioning your husband, crying too often after childbirth, loving someone you weren't supposed to, all potential signs of hysteria. And if a man, your husband, your father, your brother, decided you were a danger to yourself or your reputation, he could have you committed. No trial, no real medical assessment, just paperwork and a signature. Clarissa's story started innocently enough. She met a man at a lecture on spiritualism, some eccentric friend of her cousin's. He was charming, interested in poetry, listened when she spoke, and most dangerously wasn't her husband. They exchanged letters, secretly. He sent her books. She wrote him a poem, a single poem. Her husband found it. The next week she was taken to Rosewood. She was told it was temporary, a place to rest, to recover her wits. But the wits were never gone. The only thing unwell was her willingness to accept her marital cage, and for that she was labelled unstable. She speaks finally, her voice thin but steady. Do you know how it feels to be punished for something you never got to do? You nod. She smiles, the kind of smile that comes from having screamed yourself hoarse years ago and realising silence is the only answer people accept. You glance down at the journal in your lap. It's hers, or rather, it was, smuggled out by a sympathetic nurse during one of Clarissa's more lucid periods. The entries are scattered, sometimes poetic, sometimes sharply observational, and other times heartbreakingly confused. One line reads, "If they cut me open, would they find letters in my stomach?" Another says, "I kissed him only in my mind, but they still call me ruined." Clarissa wasn't the only one, not by a long shot. You remember reading about another woman, Eliza Hart, committed at age 34 after being found wandering at dusk with a book of romantic verse and an unsettled expression. Her brother testified that she had been acting outside the bounds of normal female restraint. She spent 12 years institutionalized. Her only real crime, writing letters to a married man in her village. Letters that were never sent. These were the forgotten victims of the Victorian obsession with emotional control. Passion, when displayed by men, was called virile. When displayed by women, it was hysteria, a clinical problem. Something to be purged with cold baths and isolation. The treatment methods were as grim as the diagnoses: bleeding, purgatives. Rest cures that amounted to solitary confinement. In some cases, forced silence. In others, laudanum or electroshock. Clarissa leans forward and shows you her wrists, not scarred, not bruised, but tense, like they've spent too long being held still. "I still dream about him," she says softly. Not even his face, just the sound of his voice. She taps her temple lightly. It echoes. You want to say something comforting, but there's nothing to say. She's not insane. She never was. But now, after all these years inside these walls, you start to wonder if she ever had a chance not to become what they said she was. There's an open debate among scholars today. How many of the women in Victorian asylums were actually suffering from mental illness? And how many were simply inconvenient? It's impossible to know, of course. Records were altered. Diagnoses were vague, but the numbers are unsettling. Too many women institutionalized for emotional instability, defiance, or unseemly conduct, terms that could mean almost anything. Clarissa's hand trembles slightly as she reaches for her teacup. The nurse gently helps her, their movements rehearsed from 1,000 repetitions. There's tenderness there, maybe even understanding, but also the cold inevitability of routine. This is her life now. She's safe, perhaps, but not free. And yet, despite it all, there's fire left in her. You see it when she talks about writing, about how she still scribbles lines of poetry on scraps of newspaper, on the backs of old prescriptions. Sometimes they let her keep them. Sometimes they take them away. "I write in my head now," she says, tapping her temple again. "That's the only room they can't lock." The sun has started to set, casting long shadows across the floor. Your visit is almost over. Clarissa seems to sense it. She reaches forward, grips your hand with surprising strength and says, "Tell them I wasn't mad. Tell them I was just in love." You nod. And as you walk back through the halls of Rosewood, past the shuttered windows and locked doors, past the women staring blankly at embroidery hoops, or out into nowhere at all, you feel the weight of 100 silenced hearts pressing in on you. This place wasn't built to heal. It was built to erase. The courtroom smells of old wood, damp coats, and something sharp, like ink mixed with sweat. You take your seat on one of the stiff wooden benches near the back, trying not to look like you're watching too closely, even though that's exactly what you came to do. The judge is already perched behind the bench like some overgrown raven in robes, his face a study in permanent disapproval. The clerk is murmuring something about public indecency and breach of contract, and the spectators are already leaning in, eyes glinting, mouths twitching, hoping for scandal. What you're witnessing isn't a murder trial or a high-stakes swindle. It's something much juicier, at least in the eyes of Victorian society, a crime of passion. The kind that makes the illustrated police news practically salivate with anticipation. The kind that starts with a glance and ends with someone's life, or at least their reputation, dragged through the streets by a team of metaphorical horses. At the centre of it all is a woman named Adelaide Henley. She's sitting quietly, gloved hands folded in her lap, looking calm but not defeated. You'd guess her to be around 35, though she wears her years like a badge, not a burden. Her dress is dark but tasteful. Her hat is trimmed in jet, and beside her, not touching her, not even looking at her, is her former lover. Or rather, the man she shot in the shoulder 6 months ago after he tried to end their affair with a letter and a brooch-shaped apology. He's alive. Mostly. His arm still rests in a sling, more dramatic than necessary. His name is Edward Bowditch, and he looks like someone who expected to be the tragic hero of this story, but is now wondering if he's become the punchline instead. The courtroom leans forward as the prosecutor begins to outline the case. Miss Henley, scorned, took a revolver from her father's desk, intercepted Mr. Bowditch outside his club, and, quote, fired with intent to maim. She missed his heart, barely. Some gasp, others grin. It's not that they approve of her actions, it's just thrilling, isn't it? A woman behaving badly, violently, passionately. It's like watching a Greek tragedy in real time, and people love a tragedy that lets them feel superior. The defence begins, and suddenly the courtroom shifts. They're not here to deny what happened. Adelaide did shoot him. No one disputes that. What her lawyer argues, though, is that the real crime began months earlier, when Edward, a man of means and married convenience, entered into a romantic relationship with Adelaide under the pretense of lifelong commitment. They exchanged vows in private, traded rings. She gave up her position at the Ladies' Academy, became his shadow, and when he grew bored, he discarded her like a prop from the third act of a play. That's when things get murky, because this isn't just about a gun. It's about betrayal, about double standards, about how Victorian society quietly tolerated male infidelity, while punishing women for even implying they had desires of their own. There's a letter read aloud to the court in which Edward writes, "You're more wife to me than the one I'm bound to by law." It's damning, not legally. But socially, devastating. There are murmurs from the audience, someone tuts, someone else laughs. The judge calls for order, but the story has already taken hold. This trial echoes real ones that scandalise the era. One such case, the 1856 trial of Madeline Smith in Scotland, involved a young woman accused of poisoning her secret lover after he threatened to expose their affair. Her love letters were read aloud in court, dissected, mocked. The press turned her into a monster and a martyr simultaneously. She was acquitted, technically, but her life was over. She fled to America, changed her name, never married. The same fate looms over Adelaide. The debate surrounding cases like hers is ongoing. Some historians argue that women like her were victims of the Victorian marriage market, promised security and love but delivered exploitation. Others say that these women were unstable, driven by irrational emotion, but those arguments always seem to ignore the unequal stakes. A man's affair could be a footnote. A woman's, a death sentence, if not literally, then socially. Back in court, Edward is testifying now. He's dramatic, shaky, clearly enjoying the attention more than he should. He refers to Adelaide as possessive, obsessive, unstable. He paints himself as the benevolent one, the man who tried to end things gently. The phrase hangs in the air like smoke from a bad cigar. Adelaide doesn't flinch, but you can see her knuckles whitening around her handkerchief. The judge calls for a recess, and the room exhales like it's just stepped out of a boiling bath. People chatter. Some rush to the corridors to send telegrams to gossip-hungry friends. You stay seated, watching Adelaide, who hasn't moved, not an inch. Eventually she's led away, not in shackles, but still surrounded by guards. She turns once, just briefly, and for a second, You see something that makes you stop breathing. It's not shame, it's relief. You realise then that the shot she fired wasn't meant to kill him. Not really. It was a scream. A desperate, bloody scream in a society that would rather women suffer quietly than make any noise at all. The verdict won't matter. Even if she walks free, she won't be truly free. No employer will touch her. No family will host her. No man will look at her without imagining the weight of her hand on a pistol. But for one moment, she rewrote the script. She refused to vanish into the grey space society had assigned her. She exploded out of it, loud and dangerous and unforgettable. You step out into the street where the drizzle has picked up. People are already spinning the story into something it's not. Madness, jealousy, female rage. You know better. Adelaide's wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of being human in a world that only allowed her to be property. You're in a back alley now, the kind that doesn't appear on city maps and somehow always smells faintly of wet rope and old cabbage. London, 1874. The city pulses around you. Flickering gas lamps, horses clopping, voices rising in clumps and echoes. But in this narrow space it's quiet. Not peaceful, not safe, just quiet. There's a door to your left, worn wood, no sign. You knock twice, then once, then twice again. The coded rhythm. The doorkeeper squints through a peephole before sliding the bolt and waving you in. Inside, everything changes. You're in a private club, unofficial, underground, unlicensed. But not the sort of club where men throw cards and smoke cigars until sunrise. No, this is a different world entirely. Velvet curtains, mirrors fogged with heat, laughter that sounds like it's been uncorked after years of silence, and colour, so much colour. Hair curled into gravity-defying spirals, sequins, silk, lip rouge, stockings rolled dangerously high. You blink twice before you realise something. Most of the people here aren't dressed in the clothes society expects them to wear. You're watching men dressed as women, women dressed as men, and everyone else existing somewhere gloriously in between. This is not just a club. It's a sanctuary for people who refuse to perform gender by the Victorian rules. You take a seat at a small table in the corner and observe. A tall figure in a red satin gown is performing a torch song at the piano, voiced low and smoky, drawing tears and laughter in equal measure. A woman in a sharply tailored evening suit flirts shamelessly with a mustachioed clerk who blushes all the way to his hairline. In this room, labels are playthings. Identity is fluid, performed, tested, rewritten nightly. You're witnessing the world of cross-dressing, drag and clandestine lives, an invisible yet vibrant part of Victorian society most history books skip entirely. The law, of course, had plenty to say about it. Cross-dressing was not explicitly illegal in Britain during the 1800s, but it was treated as evidence in cases of fraud, public indecency, or, more ominously, intent to commit sodomy, a capital crime until 1861 and still heavily punished long after. And yet, despite the risks, people did it. Night after night in cabarets, parlours, alleyways, and sometimes even on stage, coded into comedy and slapstick, dismissed as farce so no one had to acknowledge what it really was, liberation. You meet someone here, Charlie, who performs as Charlotte on Fridays and Charles on Tuesdays. They're witty, charismatic and tired. Tired of hiding, of pretending, of shifting accents and manners depending on who's watching. But here, in this space, they're alive. In the daylight, I'm nobody, they say, lighting a cigarette with steady hands. But in here, I get to be the leading lady, or the rake, or both. They tell you about others, sisters and brothers in this secret theatre. Some perform just to escape the bone-deep wrongness of their assigned identity. Others do it for thrill, for sex, for joy. One man used to be a vicar. Another, they whisper, was a member of Parliament. You realise this isn't a fringe subculture. It's a hidden majority of minorities. People who love, desire and express themselves in ways the Victorian world fears too much to name. You ask Charlie if they ever get scared. Every day, they reply, exhaling smoke through a crooked smile, but not enough to stop. The most famous case of cross-dressing in the Victorian era, at least the one that reached the courts, was that of Ernest Bolton and Frederick Park, who went by Stella and Fanny in their social circles. They were arrested in 1870 while leaving a theatre in full feminine dress and charged with conspiracy to commit sodomy. The trial became a media circus. The courtroom was packed. Their dresses were paraded as evidence. But here's the kicker, they were acquitted. Not because society was tolerant, but because the prosecution couldn't prove they had actually committed any illegal acts. The public mocked them, but their freedom became a symbol. Society might hate what it doesn't understand, but it can't always crush it. You watch as a couple dances near the edge of the room, a man in a powder blue ball gown, and a woman in a tweed coat and cravat. They move with the ease of people who've practiced hiding all their lives. No one here flinches, no one laughs. This is sacred ground. But it won't last forever. These spaces are constantly on the move, raided, shut down, forgotten. Most don't leave records. There are no guest lists, no portraits, only whispers and memories passed down like ghost stories at dusk. Some scholars argue that this makes the history unreliable. Others say that's the point. That the very act of surviving, of existing outside documentation, was the rebellion. The candlelight flickers and someone climbs onto the makeshift stage for a monologue about love. It's funny, then tragic, then funny again. The performer ends by removing their wig, slowly like shedding skin, and the room erupts into applause. It's not a reveal, it's a declaration. This is me. When you finally step outside, the air's colder than it was before, and the alley feels emptier somehow, like the building itself is pretending nothing happened. But you know better. You've seen what exists beneath the surface, and you realise that while Victorian England was busy codifying gender, policing bodies, and punishing anyone who dared stray, there were people carving out space anyway, risking arrest, humiliation, violence, just for the right to exist, to dance, to be seen, not as spectacles, not as jokes, as people. People who weren't allowed to love out loud but did it anyway, with powder, with silk, with swagger. And in the end, that might be the most forbidden love story of all. You wake to the sound of clattering dishes and a muffled argument echoing up from below. No elegant breakfast trays today, no gentle knocks on the bedroom door. You're not upstairs anymore. You're in the servants' quarters, where life in a Victorian household actually happens. It's barely dawn, and the whole world down here is already in motion. Aprons tied, fires stoked, boots polished, voices low but pointed. You slip into the narrow hallway behind the kitchen and catch a flash of a maid ducking into the scullery, eyes rolling, lips tight. Someone's late. Again. Welcome to the underworld of the Victorian home, where everyone knows everything and no one says a word out loud unless they're absolutely certain who's listening. You're following Mary now, 20, sharp, and faster with her tongue than she ought to be. She carries a tea tray with the steady hands of someone who's done it 10,000 times, but still manages to do it differently every time. A flick of the sugar spoon, a misfolded napkin. Little details that only she knows mean something. Her destination, Lady Thistlewaite's morning room. Her mission, deliver the Earl's tea and leave before anyone asks too many questions. Because Mary's been watching, listening. She knows things she shouldn't. That's the thing about servants, they see everything. Affairs, arguments, reconciliations, pregnancies announced in whispers behind the nursery door. They carry notes between rooms. They empty wastebaskets full of half-burned love letters. They know who visits, who lingers, who leaves with a coat buttoned one notch too high. In an era obsessed with appearances, the people who handled the laundry knew the truth. And Mary's no fool. She's seen Lady Thistlewaite sneak into the conservatory with the piano tutor, seen the footman, James, slip out of the gardener's shed buttoning his shirt. She knows the butler keeps 2 letters in his breast pocket, one for his sister, one for the man he calls my old friend, with too much fondness to be entirely innocent. These aren't just passing observations, they're survival tools. Down here, in the soft underbelly of aristocratic grandeur, knowledge is currency. Gossip keeps you employed or gets you sacked, depending on how and when you use it. Mary hasn't said anything yet, but she knows she could. That's power. Not much, but enough. In the laundry room, another maid, Annie, laughs too loudly at something the cook says. She's blushing. You follow her glance and see it. Thomas, the third footman, hair too neat, sleeves rolled up just enough to show forearms that have sparked more than one heated evening fantasy among the staff. He's charming, predictable, flirts with everyone and promises nothing. Annie, poor thing, is already halfway in love. But Mary's not worried about Annie. Mary's watching someone else. She turns a corner and nearly runs into Margaret, the lady's maid, older, stern, silent as a ghost unless directly spoken to. Margaret has a secret. Everyone does. But hers is different. Mary saw her once, late at night, sitting on the back steps with the housekeeper, their shoulders touching, hands nearly overlapping. They didn't kiss, didn't speak, just sat together, breathing in sync, sharing a silence that felt like a story told in full. You think about how the servants' wing is structured. Narrow hallways, thin doors, no locks. Privacy is a myth. And yet, this is where some of the most forbidden love affairs in the house actually happen. Not just because the rules are stricter, but because the margins are tighter. There's nowhere to hide, so everything is hidden in plain sight. One historian once described Victorian servants as invisible until disobedient, which feels about right. They were expected to move silently, never meet their employer's eyes, exist in the background like animated furniture. But in reality, they were the live wires of the house. They carried its emotional energy, its friction, its heat. In a grand estate near Bath, there was a scandal never made public. A maid and the master of the house caught in flagrante delicto by the butler. The butler said nothing for 10 years, until he was passed over for a promotion. Then he wrote a letter to the lady of the house full of just enough detail to prove his story. The maid was dismissed. The master denied everything. The butler got his raise, and no one ever mentioned it again. Down here, love and betrayal live side by side. You follow Mary again as she moves upstairs to the second-floor corridor, tea tray balanced with practiced grace. She knocks, enters, and for a moment you hear Lady Thistlewaite's voice. Too warm, too eager. Then a man's laughter, not the Earl's. Mary exits silently. Back in the hallway, she finally allows herself a smile. It's not smug, it's survival. She returns to the kitchen and sits beside Annie, who's still flushed from her encounter with Thomas. Mary nudges her. You know he's got a girl in town, right? Annie frowns. Says they're not serious. Mary just shrugs. They never are. This isn't cruelty, it's protection. You start to notice all the little love stories happening here. The cook and the fishmonger who leaves extra cod on Thursdays. The scullery maid who keeps a pressed flower in her apron pocket from a suitor who went to sea. The valet who wears cologne sent by someone whose letters arrive without a return address. They love. Just like the people upstairs. Maybe more fiercely because they have less room for illusion. But unlike upstairs, down here, no one expects a wedding. There are no arranged matches, no dowries, no legacies to protect. Only moments, snatched between shifts, behind pantry doors, under the stairs. Short, sharp bursts of affection in a world that doesn't leave space for happy endings. And sometimes, it's enough. Sometimes it's a hand brushed across a shoulder, a whispered promise, a scarf left on a pillow, a look held too long. Because even in the depths of hierarchy, behind the lace and gold, beneath the chandeliers and drawing rooms, love still finds a way to bloom. Quietly, in the dark, where no one expects to find it. There's a clink in the china and a pause in the air that wasn't there a moment ago. You're seated at a dinner table longer than most hallways, where the flicker of candlelight plays tricks on polished silver, and the smell of roasted duck and port sauce mingles with something less welcoming. Tension. You feel it first in your neck, then in your stomach, like your body knows before your brain does. Around you, the guests laugh, sip wine, and pick at courses with practiced disinterest. But something's off, and it starts with the tea. Lady Thorne lifts her teacup with elegant fingers, takes a delicate sip, and freezes. Only for a second, but you catch it. A subtle tightening around her mouth. Her hand trembles just slightly before she sets the cup down with the kind of care usually reserved for ancient relics or sleeping vipers. Next to her sits her husband, Sir William Thorne, red-faced and jolly, barking some half-charming anecdote about horses or stocks, or the perils of goose hunting in the rain. He doesn't notice. But across the table, Miss Evelyn Montrose, young, sharp-eyed, quietly watchful, does. Her gaze flickers from the cup to Lady Thorne's face. Something passes between them. Not words. Not even a look, really. Just knowledge. Because Evelyn knows exactly what's in that tea. Welcome to the darker side of Victorian romance. The part they don't engrave on calling cards or slip into love poems. Welcome to betrayal, jealousy and revenge served hot, lightly sweetened, and possibly laced with arsenic. Victorian England had a fascination with poison, and it's not hard to see why. It was discreet, effective, and available in every chemist's shop under the polite label of household substances. Arsenic, strychnine, laudanum, You could pick up a fatal dose alongside your cold remedy. And if you were smart about it, no one would ever know. Tea was the perfect vehicle. Everyone drank it. Constantly. It was so ordinary, so innocent that no one ever suspected it. Until it was too late. Evelyn wasn't supposed to be here tonight. She'd been sent away last season to visit relatives. A polite way of banishing someone whose presence had become inconvenient. Her flirtation with Sir William had crossed one too many thresholds, metaphorically and otherwise. Lady Thorne found out, or rather, she saw enough to know. A misplaced hand on a wrist, a dress strap loosened in the hallway. A kiss, perhaps, behind the library curtain. It wasn't love, of course not. It was power, youth, the thrill of being noticed, and now Evelyn's back. Invited curiously by Lady Thorne herself, a gesture of forgiveness, a social performance, or something else entirely. The tea steams gently in china cups as the conversation continues, oblivious. Sir William begins a toast. Glasses rise. Evelyn sips her own tea, calm and expressionless. Lady Thorne hasn't touched hers again. Across the table you see the butler watching too closely, not the way a servant watches, the way someone does when they're part of something. His eyes move from Lady Thorne to Evelyn and back again, and you realise he knows too. Maybe not the whole story, but enough. He's seen the letters. He's cleaned the guest room after Evelyn stayed the last time. He noticed when the silver tea strainer was left in the library, where it never should have been. There's a long, strange tradition of poisoning in English domestic life. Most of it, scholars argue, was driven by desperation. Trapped wives, unfaithful husbands, affairs gone wrong. Women without power often turned to the one domain where they ruled absolutely: the kitchen, the teapot, the medicine cabinet. In one infamous case from 1846, a woman named Sarah Chesham was accused of slowly poisoning multiple family members with arsenic stirred into gruel and tea. She was tried several times and ultimately hanged. But to this day, historians debate whether she was a cold-blooded killer or simply the scapegoat for a series of tragic illnesses in a household that didn't want to look too closely. Here at this dinner table, you can almost see that same question forming in the candlelight. Is this murder? A warning? A bluff? Evelyn sets down her cup. Her lips curve slightly. Not a smile, exactly. More like satisfaction smoothed over with civility. She dabs the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin, then says to no one in particular, "It's a lovely blend. Rose hips." Lady Thorne answers without looking up. "Jasmine, and something bitter." Sir William chuckles, missing the subtext entirely, but a few other guests do not. The woman beside you suddenly seems less hungry. The man at the end of the table coughs into his napkin and excuses himself. It's not chaos yet, but it's stirring. Then Lady Thorne finally lifts her cup again, tilts it just enough to wet her lips. She doesn't drink, just holds it there, like a dare. Evelyn watches her closely, and for a moment, the entire table vanishes. There's just the two of them, the wife and the mistress, the betrayed and the betrayer, or maybe, depending on how you read the story, the wronged and the righteous. Who poisoned whom, if anyone did at all? That's the riddle. It's possible there's nothing in the tea except tension. It's also possible that someone planned for this night all week, measuring out bitterness in grains instead of words. But maybe, and this is the truly Victorian possibility, it's not the poison that matters. It's the performance, the suggestion, the theatre of accusation played out in silence and porcelain, a public execution of trust carried out over dinner. You rise quietly from the table, slipping out into the hall where the candlelight doesn't reach. Behind you, laughter starts up again, a little louder, a little more forced. The tension doesn't dissolve, it just hides behind the next course. And as you step outside into the cold night air, you can't help but think that Victorian love affairs weren't always about longing and repression. Sometimes they were about vengeance, served with milk and sugar, and sometimes not. The bookshop is tucked between a tobacconist and a narrow tailor's storefront, its window crowded with volumes too sun-bleached to read, and a velvet curtain half pulled across, as if the stories inside might be contagious. You step in, and immediately the air changes. Musty, warm, tinged with the scent of old paper and secrets. The bell above the door tinkles, a sharp metallic sound, and the man behind the counter doesn't even look up. He's used to the quiet kind of customer, the kind that doesn't want help, just space. This is where the forbidden lies in plain sight. Here, in this dusty haven, fiction isn't just entertainment, it's survival, it's communication, it's an unspoken code, passed from hand to trembling hand, from reader to reader, folded between pages like the dried petals of a memory no one dares speak aloud. You trail your fingers along the spines. Most are respectable. Novels by Dickens, Trollope, the Brontes. But look closer, and you'll see them. The books no one recommends out loud. The ones whispered about behind fans and hidden behind heavier, duller titles. A slim volume bound in plain brown cloth catches your eye. No title, no author. Just an embossed M in the corner. You flip it open. The print is small and tight, and it takes only a few lines to realise what you found. It's a love story. But not the kind with a neatly resolved courtship, a chaste kiss at the end, and a walk down the aisle before chapter 20. No, this is something different. Two women, a garden, letters hidden inside gloves, hushed laughter behind rose bushes. It's delicate and bold at once, like the author tried to confess and protect herself in the same breath. The bookshop sells these kinds of novels quietly. The owner never asks questions. Sometimes he doesn't even charge, depending on the title. Just nods and slips it into a plain paper wrapping, because he knows what this place is, a sanctuary, a secret library, a matchstick in the dark. You move to the back shelf where things get murkier. Here the books aren't just fiction, they're fantasy, satire, allegory, and coded all the way down. A romantic tale of two soldiers who share a tent for warmth, written under the guise of war brotherhood. A gothic novel where a governess falls in love with a woman she believes is a ghost, only to realise she's alive, and very much aware of the governess's feelings. These stories had to hide inside genre, horror, fairy tale, mystery, because saying the truth too plainly was dangerous. If a book was deemed obscene, it could be seized. The author charged, the publisher ruined, and what counted as obscene? Almost anything involving women with desires of their own, or love that didn't align with marriage and inheritance. You take a seat near the fire where another reader, a man in a tweed coat and soft leather gloves, sits cross-legged with a worn book of verse. You recognise a line as he mutters it aloud. He touched me with a look I dare not name. It's not famous, not even published under a real name, but it carries weight. Someone once copied that line into a diary, folded it into a letter, maybe even carved it into the wood of a boarding school desk. This, you realise, is how so many Victorian love affairs survived. Not in daylight, not in photographs or public declarations, but in ink, coded, passed, treasured. Read by candlelight and then hidden under floorboards. There's a story often dismissed as urban legend about a woman in Liverpool who opened her husband's copy of Jane Eyre one morning and found a second novel inside. Handwritten. A romance between two men, carefully bound, gently inserted. He'd carried it for years, said nothing, died with it on his shelf. She never told anyone, just donated the book, anonymous, decades later. Scholars have long debated the influence of these hidden texts. Some argue they were cathartic but ultimately impotent, a way for people to dream but never act. Others believe they were revolutionary, that without these coded novels and clandestine poems, people would have believed they were alone, that their feelings were illness, madness, sin. But these books whispered otherwise. They said, "You are not alone. You're not the first. You're not broken." You see this in a young woman who enters the shop, head down, coat pulled tight. She's here for one book in particular. She doesn't ask aloud, just writes a name on a scrap of paper and slides it across the counter. The shopkeeper raises an eyebrow, then nods. From behind the till he retrieves a volume bound in blue silk. She clutches it like a child holds a charm against nightmares. You want to ask her what she's found in it, but you already know. These books carried maps, not literal ones, but emotional ones. They showed readers how love might look if the world weren't watching, how desire might feel if it didn't have to be punished. Some were sad, some were angry. A few were bold enough to be joyful, despite everything. All were radical in their own quiet way. You thumb through a volume by an anonymous author who describes a kiss so gently it barely counts as a sentence. And then, in the moment between speech and silence, I tasted spring on her lips. You wonder how many people read that line and felt something crack open inside them. The fire crackles. The shop glows with the hush of shared secrets. Outside, the sky is grey again, and the world is just as rigid and unforgiving as it was yesterday. But in here, for now, there's room. Room for fantasy, for coded truth, for love that's forbidden, but no less real. And when you finally rise to go, you carry more than one book in your coat pocket. You carry an inheritance, the knowledge that even when people were told to hide, they wrote, they risked, they reached, and that someone like you was always waiting to read it. The ballroom is vast, colder than you expect for an evening event in the city. The air tinged with perfume and candle smoke. Crystal chandeliers dangle overhead, casting fractured light across a polished floor that gleams like a sheet of water. Music swells from the orchestra pit, a waltz that's supposed to feel elegant, graceful. But you notice the subtle tension in the dancers' shoulders, the slight quickening of breath in those trying to maintain appearances. Every smile is practiced, every hand extended is a negotiation of propriety. This is Victorian England at its most performative, the veneer of romance laid over the rigid architecture of expectation. You drift near the back of the room, observing a young couple, seemingly a courtship in progress. Lady Beatrice Mayhew, barely 16, is pressed close to a young gentleman, Sir Lionel Darnell, whose hand rests just high enough on her back to satisfy societal norms without inviting scandal. Her eyes, though, are elsewhere, flicking, darting to the corners of the room. You follow the direction of her gaze and see the true story. A governess, Miss Julia Henley, standing by the orchestra, clutching sheet music, shoulders squared, face pale but determined. Sir Lionel has been sending her notes for months, carefully concealed in envelopes slipped into books and letters marked for the nursery. The affair is quiet, almost invisible to the casual eye. But here, in the careful choreography of the ballroom, it's a tension that could snap at any moment. You think about how courtship worked in this era. Hours spent dancing, walking in gardens, polite letters exchanged under the gaze of chaperones and families who claimed to want nothing more than to ensure a suitable match. And yet, within that structure, rebellion found its own small spaces. Hands brushed during the minuet. Glances held a second too long during the quadrille. Notes folded into gloves, hidden in fans, slipped behind hymnals. The very rigidity of society became a canvas for secret defiance. Here, even servants and musicians played roles in clandestine connections. One young violinist, barely 20, has been courting a chambermaid, delivering lines of borrowed poetry between movements. They meet under stairwells and in service corridors, exchanging touches, glances, and whispered words. These are the quiet lives, the miniature revolutions that exist below the surface of high society spectacle.
Scholars argue about the role of these enforced social rituals. Some insist that Victorian propriety repressed desire to the point of creating unhealthy fixations, obsessions, and dangerous affairs. Others claim it forced people to develop emotional intelligence, subtlety, and creativity in expressing affection. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps every stolen touch, every coded note, is proof that love adapts, bends, and thrives even under the tightest constraints. Back in the ballroom, a small incident unfolds. Lady Beatrice's mother moves toward the couple to direct her daughter, and Sir Lionel instinctively turns toward Miss Julia to avert suspicion. Their eyes meet, and it's brief, electric, a silent conversation carried through decades of societal rules. A question, a plea, a reassurance. No words, but enough for each to know that the other understands. Such small exchanges often defined Victorian love more than speeches or public displays ever could. You notice other coded interactions. A gentleman adjusting a lady's fan just so, a wink that's more than polite, a touch of the hand at the conclusion of a dance that seems accidental but carries weight. The room is a tapestry of hidden passions, all threading through the social fabric like invisible embroidery. There's even something fringe, stories of secret trysts staged in ballrooms themselves. A clever couple might use the chaos of dance formations to exchange letters or slip away unnoticed to side rooms or stairwells. The architecture of entertainment, the sequence of dances, and the reliance on protocol offered cover for acts forbidden by daylight morality. You catch a glance at the orchestra leader, who is more than he seems. He winks at a young cellist and nods toward a hidden balcony. Upstairs, unseen by the majority, a clandestine meeting awaits. two people who aren't supposed to be together sharing stolen time. Music, after all, is not just art in Victorian England. It's a tool for subterfuge, masking whispers and footsteps beneath its swell. By the time the final waltz ends, the room is alight with applause. The public performance of propriety resumes. Guests nod, curtsy, smile. Dance cards are tucked away, handshakes are exchanged. And yet, beneath the surface, the affairs continue. Glances linger, notes pass, plans are made for tomorrow. In Victorian society, love existed not in the daylight of recognition, but in the shadows of the ballroom, the library, the hallway, where even a look could ignite revolution. And as you leave the polished floor, stepping into the cool night, you carry with you the lesson of the evening, that Victorian love, forbidden and forced into secrecy, often burned brightest where no one dared watch. You slip into the dim glow of a candlelit corridor that smells faintly of wax, dust, and the lingering perfume of flowers long wilted. This is the hallway of a boarding house near Bloomsbury, modest, unassuming, almost invisible from the street, yet alive with the heartbeat of lives carefully concealed. You pause outside a door marked simply with the initial L. Inside, the small room is cluttered with books, folded dresses, a writing desk, crowded with ink pots and half-finished letters. A single window looks out onto a narrow alley, sunlight filtering through the grime, turning the room into a stage for shadows and light. Here lives Lillian, a woman who has learned the art of invisible existence. By day, she teaches children, correcting slanted handwriting and the awkward rise of "thee" in their speech. By night, she becomes a writer, a chronicler of forbidden love. Her stories are not just fiction. They are coded messages, veiled autobiographies disguised as melodrama or satire. In one, she writes of two governesses trapped under the same roof, exchanging letters hidden in hymnals, their love blooming in the narrow space between walls and duty. In another, a young man and woman, forbidden by rank and family, communicate only through marginalia in books lent to one another. These tales echo her own desires, the possibilities she dares not explore openly. Lillian is careful. Each letter she writes, each story she types or copies, is a labyrinth of symbols, metaphors, and misdirection. The letters might speak of flowers, music, or the weather, but the reader who knows can discern the real message between the lines. Love, longing, rebellion. She learned early that in Victorian society, words had power, but not the kind you might assume. They could be censored, intercepted, or twisted to ruin you. So she writes in invisible ink, in codes derived from florography, in initials that only the intended recipient could recognize. A knock at the door breaks her concentration. Lillian freezes, heart pounding. Outside stands Margaret, her friend and confidant, who works as a seamstress in the next building. They exchange a coded glance, the lift of an eyebrow, a curl of the lip, and the meaning is clear. The letters arrived. A bundle of notes folded inside a parcel, ink slightly smudged, the handwriting familiar, yet dangerous. They are from Eleanor, a woman Lillian has loved from afar for months, restricted by propriety, circumstance, and the fear of scandal. These clandestine correspondences are not rare in Victorian England, though they were rarely preserved. Lovers communicated through anything that could carry a message safely: letters, books, fans, even pressed flowers. Scholars debate how widespread these networks were. Some argue they were isolated pockets of intimacy, rare and secretive. Others insist they formed a covert social web that connected women and men who could not speak openly, effectively creating a parallel society of coded desire. Lillian takes the letters, handling them with reverence. Each one is alive with voice and presence, imbued with an intimacy no spoken word could convey. They contain careful observations, half-forgotten jokes, subtle signs of affection disguised as mundane conversation. One reads, "The tulips are blooming today, as if to laugh at those who cannot see them," a simple remark on the garden outside. But the meaning is clear to Lillian. It is a declaration, hidden yet present, playful yet urgent. The room is small, but the air hums with possibility. The letters are proof that desire survives in confinement, in silence, in secrecy. Outside, the city continues its daily march, oblivious to the revolutions occurring in attic rooms, in narrow alleys, behind shutters and closed doors. Here, love is invisible, but no less potent. It's a rebellion disguised as routine, a life sketched between obligations and impossibilities. Lillian sets down the letters and leans over the desk, pen in hand, ready to reply in kind. The letters will travel again, moving invisibly across streets, through windows, under the noses of society. Each word chosen with care, each symbol deliberate. In this careful dance, Lillian has found freedom. Not freedom in the daylight, not freedom recognized by laws or titles, but freedom in the secret, encoded love she nurtures and preserves, a private universe within the walls of an indifferent world. And as the candle flickers, shadows lengthening across her desk, you realize that Victorian love often thrived not in bold acts or declarations, but in the quiet, measured persistence of those who refused to vanish. The rain outside hammers the cobblestones like a metronome, relentless and precise. You duck beneath the overhang of a narrow pub doorway, its sign swinging lazily in the wind, and glance up at the dim windows. Inside, the glow of lanterns and hearth fire promises warmth, but also secrecy. This is the sort of place Victorian England allowed to exist only because it appeared harmless. The drunken poet's arms, beer and cider, smoke curling from the chimney, a piano in the corner. But what you find here, beyond the scent of malt and pipe smoke, is far from ordinary. This is a haven for lovers who cannot love openly, a sanctuary for forbidden desires, a refuge for those who navigate passion against the rigid constraints of social expectation. Inside, the air is thick with low conversation and the clatter of tankards. In a back booth, partially hidden by heavy velvet curtains, you see them. A writer and a young artist, elbows brushing, eyes locked. Their hands are close enough to touch, but not yet daring. Each movement is deliberate. Their glances communicate more than words ever could. In Victorian society, a public display of intimacy outside marriage was scandalous, especially between women or between men. And yet here, they exist almost fearlessly, almost. The threat of exposure hovers like a shadow over the booth. If discovered, reputations could be ruined, jobs lost, families shamed. Arrests, while rare, were always possible under laws designed to punish indecency. This is not an isolated incident. Pubs, taverns, and other semi-public spaces became clandestine meeting points for forbidden love. Historians note that by the mid-19th century, London was threaded with a network of such spaces, discreet, largely overlooked by law enforcement, and often protected by sympathetic landlords. Some establishments even specialized in facilitating discreet meetings, providing coded menus or signals for those who knew the signs. One famously included a back room marked only by a brass key, where letters were exchanged and sketches made, entirely out of view. You notice the artist, a young woman with ink-stained fingers, tracing the edge of her sketchbook in a gesture that is both nervous and deliberate. She is sketching her lover, not their face exactly, but a coded likeness, a pattern of posture, a curl of hair, the arch of a shoulder. The sketch is intended for no one else's eyes, preserved as proof that desire existed, that intimacy survived. The writer leans over, whispering a sentence into her ear, and she smiles faintly, shivering at the cadence. It is poetry and longing, observation and confession, all wrapped into one act. Some of these meetings left evidence: diaries, sketchbooks, letters hidden in piano benches, hollowed-out books, even hollowed chairs. Other times, they left nothing, vanished without a trace, known only to the participants, and that vanishing, in itself, became a form of rebellion. Scholars debate the prevalence of such affairs. Were they rare anomalies or widespread, unnoticed by the official record? The truth is obscured because so much of what occurred was deliberately ephemeral. And yet, glimpses remain, letters discovered decades later, marginalia in novels, references in personal diaries. A curious thing emerges in this tavern. A man and a woman at the bar, both clearly married to other people. Their hands brush accidentally, or not so accidentally, under the counter. A servant brings a fresh tankard, oblivious. Their conversation is coded, layered, almost musical. References to books that mean trysts, visits that imply secret rendezvous, weather that signals longing. This is the language of survival, the creativity born from repression. Their affair is impossible to define legally, socially, or morally. Yet, it exists fully, vibrantly, dangerously. Across the room, someone hums a tune on the piano, a melancholy, half-forgotten melody that threads through the air like a secret signal. The patrons barely notice, but for those attuned, it is the cue to look, to lean closer, to whisper, to reach. This interplay of risk and intimacy is the defining characteristic of forbidden love in Victorian England. The thrill, the danger, the constant calculation. Exposure could ruin everything, yet it also amplifies desire. The tavern closes eventually, reluctantly, as lanterns are extinguished and the last patrons leave into the foggy night. You step out into the cold, heart still pounding from proximity to so much quiet intensity. The city's streets are slick with rain, reflections of gas lamps stretching long and wavering across the cobbles. Hidden loves, coded glances, secret sketches, they all disappear into the night. The risk, the thrill, the life lived in shadows remains. And you realize that even in a world determined to suppress feeling, affection found its corners. Not in courts, not in drawing rooms, not in polite conversation, but in the flickering, dimly lit, breathing spaces where people dared to exist just as they were. The carriage rattles through the narrow streets of London, wooden wheels clattering against uneven cobblestones, rain dripping from the awning above. You peer through the side window at the foggy glow of gas lamps, the blurred silhouettes of pedestrians hurrying home, umbrellas bobbing like dark flowers against the mist. Tonight, you're not headed to a grand manor, a tavern, or a ballroom. No, you're going to the house of Dr. Harcourt, a physician whose discreet practice caters to the peculiarities of desire, secrecy, and propriety. His patients aren't only ill in body, they are unwell in love, trapped in circumstances society refuses to acknowledge, suffering in silence because the world around them lacks vocabulary for their existence. Dr. Harcourt's office is small, lined with shelves of medical texts, ledgers, and journals. There's a faint smell of tincture and antiseptic, an odd mixture that immediately signals both care and constraint. Here, in this quiet room, Victorian England allowed some degree of control to slip. A patient could confess fears, longings, and indiscretions without being judged, without immediate consequence. These consultations weren't recorded in the newspapers. They didn't require witnesses or chaperones. They were, in a sense, private sanctuaries of acknowledgement in a public world obsessed with performance. Tonight, a young woman is seated in the corner, pale, hands folded neatly in her lap. She is Miss Clara Evans, a governess who has spent years observing life from the margins, inside grand estates, hidden behind lace curtains, serving as both educator and silent confidant. Her eyes flicker toward Dr. Harcourt as he enters, and you notice a subtle tension in her shoulders. Clara's affections are for someone she cannot openly love, another woman, Miss Agnes Linton, who teaches in the neighboring household. Their intimacy exists in brief letters, glances across garden gates, and touches brushed into the fabric of a shared scarf. It is not marriageable, not acknowledged, not even fully recognized, and yet it is deeply real. Victorian physicians often played the dual role of caretaker and social arbiter. Homosexuality, or inversion, as it was sometimes termed in medical texts, was pathologized. But some practitioners, particularly those with discretion and a progressive understanding of human desire, offered more than diagnosis. They provided counsel, subtle guidance, even practical means to maintain clandestine relationships safely. The debate among historians remains unresolved. Were these physicians upholding societal control or quietly enabling rebellion? In Clara's case, it seems to lean toward the latter. Dr. Harcourt speaks softly, cautiously, as if even the walls have ears. He reviews Clara's letter cache, arranged meticulously in a wooden box, folded notes, a pressed violet, a scrap of music written in code. He makes no judgment. He offers advice, how to avoid discovery, how to exchange correspondence securely, even how to interpret gestures and words that may carry hidden meaning. These instructions are not mere safety tips. They are lifelines in a world that punishes desire. Clara listens, absorbing every word, nodding minutely. Her pulse rises slightly when Dr. Harcourt mentions the patterns of glances that often precede social exposure. She remembers the last garden visit with Agnes, the subtle brush of hands, the whispered joke only they could understand, the way Agnes's hair fell across her shoulder and lingered in memory long after it should have been forgotten. The physician notes her reaction, nods with understanding, and writes a discreet prescription, not of medicine, but of discretion, strategy, and self-preservation. You watch Clara leave the office later, envelope of letters tucked securely in her reticule, walking back into the darkened streets with a kind of quiet defiance. Each step is measured, cautious, aware. The love she carries is forbidden, but it is also alive, tangible, vital. Dr. Harcourt watches her disappear into the mist, satisfied in the knowledge that he has done more than treat symptoms. He has preserved possibility. Historians continue to debate the role of medical professionals in regulating sexual and emotional behavior in Victorian England. Were they oppressors codifying norms under the guise of care? Or subtle allies, quietly protecting those whose hearts dared to defy law and custom? The records are fragmentary, anecdotal, yet the evidence of these secret interventions lingers, scattered in diaries, letters, and the faint traces of coded advice passed down in confidence. As you step back into the foggy London night, Clara's silhouette merges with the shadows, and you realize that much of forbidden love in this era existed in these interstitial spaces. The margins of society, the quiet corridors of the human mind, and the discreet guidance of those few who could navigate both compassion and discretion. Love, unrecognized by law or convention, survived in silence and strategy, in letters, glances, and clandestine meetings. Even in the strictest, most moralistic society, desire carved out its own spaces to flourish, fragile, hidden, but indomitable. The docks are slick with rain, lanterns casting long, wavering shadows across the wooden planks. You step carefully, boots splashing in puddles, watching the ropes and barrels piled haphazardly along the quay. Ships groan and creak, ropes straining as cargo is shifted, and the smell of salt and coal burns in your nose. This is the city's underbelly, a place where deals are made, secrets exchanged, and fortunes risked, all out of sight of polite society. But tonight, you're not here for commerce. You're here for love, the kind that cannot thrive in parlors or ballrooms, the kind that belongs to the margins, the mist, the foggy spaces between legality and desire. You find them near a low-hung mast, leaning against the ropes like conspirators in a play. One is a young sailor, coat soaked through, hands rough and calloused, eyes bright with quiet excitement. The other, a woman disguised in plain working clothes, has tucked her skirts high enough to pass unnoticed among the laborers. They exchange a letter, folded and creased, the writing tight and angular. A glance, a small smile, and she tucks the paper into the breast of her jacket. No one else notices. No one needs to. The world here is too busy to watch, yet every movement is laden with risk. Discovery could mean arrest, scandal, or violent reprisal. This was not uncommon. Victorian England's port cities were rife with hidden romances, particularly among working-class populations. Sailors, dock workers, and women who labored in warehouses and markets often formed attachments under conditions that society would have deemed improper or impossible. Letters were the lifeblood of these connections, exchanged surreptitiously, sometimes smuggled in crates of goods, sometimes hidden inside barrels or sacks. In one documented instance, a young woman placed letters in the hollow of a rope spool, which traveled across the channel to a sailor in a distant port. These communications allowed love to exist despite distance, class barriers, and the constant threat of exposure. You notice the woman, the disguised lover, pause to glance up at a lantern swinging overhead. Her hair, damp with rain, clings to her neck, and her breath clouds in the cold night air. The sailor takes her hand, briefly, just enough to communicate reassurance. No words, just touch, and the gesture is enough. They are part of a vast network of clandestine attachments, bound by letters, shared glances, and fleeting moments of physical contact that society forbade. Some of these romances were documented in court records, often when a letter was intercepted or a clandestine meeting discovered. Men and women were charged with indecency, seduction, or breach of contract. Others simply disappeared from history, leaving no trace but the occasional diary entry or a smuggled letter. Scholars debate the scope and frequency of these port city affairs. Were they isolated incidents of illicit behavior, or part of a pervasive, unrecorded pattern of emotional and physical intimacy that ran parallel to the strictures of law and propriety? Evidence suggests the latter. The sailor whispers something, and the woman laughs softly, barely audible above the creaking of the rigging. Their intimacy is simple, a shared joke, a plan for meeting the following week, an acknowledgement that what they feel is real, even if it cannot be recognized. It is a rebellion in miniature, a refusal to submit entirely to the rigid structures around them. The docks, with their shadows, their noise, and their constant motion, provide the perfect cover. Love here thrives not because the world condones it, but because the world is too preoccupied to notice. Nearby, a crate shifts with the movement of dock hands. Inside, a bundle of letters in tied twine rocks gently, forgotten by anyone but the pair who placed it there. In each letter is the story of their longing, their careful plotting, the tiny acts of daring that keep their connection alive. Some letters are mundane, written in code or metaphors drawn from the sea itself. The tide will bring you safely home, or I've stored the letters beneath the anchor. Others are urgent, raw, unrestrained. I cannot bear a day without knowing your voice. Each one is a lifeline, fragile and precious, the thread connecting two hearts against the rigid order of society. As they part, the woman slipping back into the shadows of the warehouse district and the sailor heading toward his ship, you realize the significance of this hidden world. These are not reckless youths. These are people carving out pockets of freedom in a world that offers none. Love here is daring, creative, and dangerous. It survives because it must, in defiance of social constraints, family expectations, and the ever-present threat of legal or social consequences. You step back into the rain-soaked quay, listening to the splash of water and the groan of ropes. Somewhere in the darkness, two hearts continue to beat in synchrony, unseen, unrecorded, but profoundly alive. In Victorian England, forbidden love was not always about grandeur or poetry. It was often about survival, secrecy, and the small, courageous acts of connection that flickered in the spaces society tried to deny. You find yourself in the dim glow of a library, the kind that smells faintly of old leather, mothballs, and dust disturbed only by the turning of a page. The shelves rise impossibly high, so thick with books that climbing ladders creak under the weight of curiosity alone. This is a private library, hidden behind a side door in a wealthy merchant's townhouse, where love letters, journals, and forbidden trysts are preserved under the guise of academic pursuit. You wander among the stacks, and as you do, the patterns emerge, the careful arrangement of diaries, the coded volumes tucked behind dictionaries, and marginalia that reads like whispered confessions from century-old hands. Here is the culmination of all the secret histories you've been following. Men and women, young and old, aristocrats and servants alike, who lived and loved in ways that society refused to record publicly. On the upper shelves, a box contains letters between two women who shared a small flat for decades, unnoticed by family or neighbors. On a lower shelf, A collection of envelopes contains correspondence between a governess and her student's cousin, each line filled with longing carefully hidden in mundane complaints about the weather or chores. Each artifact represents a life lived quietly, in defiance of the rigid moral codes that dominated the era. Victorian England thrived on appearances. To challenge them was dangerous. But these lovers, these secret correspondents, navigated the shadows with ingenuity. They hid messages in books, in hollowed furniture, in the seams of clothing. They used code, poetry, florals, and music to convey desire. Scholars debate whether these methods were merely creative coping mechanisms or revolutionary acts in a society that sought to suppress human emotion. Perhaps they were both. Perhaps necessity and rebellion are inseparable when love is forbidden. You carefully lift a leather-bound journal. The writing is small, meticulous, and at times frantic. A married woman detailing an affair with a widower, letters exchanged in the pockets of jackets, glances shared at society gatherings, the thrill of proximity tempered by constant fear. Her words are full of longing, humor, and regret, a testament to resilience and the complex moral landscape in which she navigated her feelings. Nearby, a box contains tiny folded sheets of paper, yellowed with age, a sailor and a harbor worker, their correspondence chronicling a love that spanned ports and months of separation, preserved with meticulous care. These letters survived the storm of history because someone, somewhere, dared to hold on. You notice that the library is not just a repository of paper, it is a testament to survival. Here, the marginalized, the forbidden, and the overlooked have a voice. The letters, journals, and coded novels speak louder than any public record ever could, painting a vivid portrait of a society in which love was policed, controlled, and punished, yet persisted nonetheless. In each story, there is courage, the courage to feel, to write, to exchange, and to preserve in the face of relentless social scrutiny. Some affairs ended quietly, some ended tragically. Others survived, unnoticed and unrecorded, their existence known only to the hearts that created them. You linger near the window as dusk falls, light fading over the city rooftops, imagining all the lovers who lived, wrote, and waited in secret. A governess, a mistress, a sailor, a wife, a young noblewoman, an artist, a poet. They were all bound by the same paradox. Love was natural, vital, and necessary, yet criminalized or dismissed if it crossed society's invisible lines. Here, surrounded by the tangible evidence of their lives, you feel the enormity of what they risked. For some, it was merely survival. For others, it was rebellion. For all, it was proof that even in the strictest society, desire cannot be entirely contained. You close the last journal, place the letters back in their boxes, and step back, letting the weight of the room settle around you. This collection, hidden and curated in secrecy, is a mirror of the hidden lives of Victorian lovers. It confirms that the heart's yearnings, messy, dangerous, exhilarating, found expression even when every social force attempted to silence them. You feel the gravity of generations of secret devotion, their courage etched not in stone or heraldry, but in ink and paper. And as you step out into the cool night, the city alive with its own hidden rhythms, you understand. Forbidden love in Victorian England was everywhere, thriving in silence, surviving in the shadows, and echoing through time.